I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker. So the movie rests in the visuals, and it's very hard to predict exactly how that's going to play until you've actually cut it together. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue. The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. You know, I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly. And I take some real risks in moving the story along faster than what most people are used to in a movie. But it's a style that I established in the very first film, and I've continued to use it in all of the films so that they all are consistent in terms of the style and the way they're put together and the way the story is told. And that isn't just an editorial style. It's, you know, the acting style is done that way, the visual style. And I say the general idea of having the story be told through visuals rather than through dialogue. You know, visuals are music, basically. There's music through the entire movie. And even when there's no music, it's a musical decision not to have the music. It's a counterpoint kind of thing. This whole series of films is based on a 30s genre, on a serial. The acting style is very much from the 30s. Conceptually, it's using the influence and the inspiration of the 30s films as its basis, and the most central of which, obviously, is the Saturday matinee serial.
Welcome back, everyone, to the legacy of George Lucas. This is part 3 of what was originally meant to be one single very long video, which is now multiple very long videos, focused on discussing and negating all of the many, many lies and misinformation which have been spread online and elsewhere about Star Wars creator George Lucas, and which has been mostly perpetrated by the mainstream media, social media influencers, and a certain pathetic collective of disgruntled Star Wars fans, most of which come from a time where buying a house was in the same price bracket as buying a second-hand Subaru is today. So it's no wonder just how out of touch some of these individuals and their perceptions of both Star Wars and George Lucas truly were.
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped...
Retarded, like really retarded.
This is a crucial scene, George, and you fucked it up.
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
And in the years since, have simply been parroted ad nauseum by their newer generation copycats who are just as clueless, or in certain cases were simply vindictive in their attempts to discredit George Lucas, or just outright hollow in their words because they were looking to regurgitate some mindless drivel that someone else propagated in order to pander to popular opinion fallacy online in order to soak in some revenue. But also much of what these individuals had to say in the way of quote-unquote criticism of both George Lucas the man and his style of filmmaking is what directly led to the almost unanimously despised Disney trilogy, as well as its spin-offs.
These are my kids. So
All those Star Wars films.
all the Star Wars films.
They were your kids.
Yeah, well, they are right. You know, I loved them. I created them. I'm very intimately involved in them, and obviously to
And
sell
you
them off.
sold them.
I sold them to the white slavers that take these things and And
But I mean,
And much of said quote-unquote criticism, which was selectively fixated on George Lucas's newer Star Wars films and Star Wars edits, pretending that there was this massive discrepancy between the making and quality of George Lucas's prequel trilogy, as well as the objectively canonical, author-approved Star Wars original trilogy, and the unpolished, and according to Lucas himself, unfinished childhood trilogy.
I've wanted to do this ever since I did the movie. You know, if you go back and you check the interviews of when I made the movie and everybody said, oh, this is so wonderful. I said, well, it didn't turn out very well. It's only about 40% of what I wanted it to be. You know, I'm really disappointed in it. And every interview, relentlessly, right through the thing. And everybody said, what is he talking about? This guy's got to be crazy. And so obviously everybody who works with me has been hearing this for 20 years. As a matter of fact, I think they were relieved. Well, finally, he's going to do it. He's going to get it. We don't have to listen to this anymore. But there's a lot of things I was disappointed about in that movie, and I wasn't real happy with it when it came out, and never felt it really got finished.
I guess there's a saying among directors that a film is never finished, it's just abandoned. And for other directors, it's the film is never finished, they just finally take it away from you at some point. But no matter how the story goes, the director is usually left frustrated and not feeling that he's been able to complete his vision, or it's been altered one way or another.
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped.
Which this same pathetic collective shamelessly and delusionally clings to as the ultimate untouchable marvel of cinema, to the point of it basically becoming a fan fiction of their own at this point, as it fades further and further into obscurity, especially given the fact that these same individuals preach about the ethics of film preservation, but seem to have absolutely no issue with making fan fiction Frankenstein cuts of the films that deliberately defy the creator's wishes.
You're a first class.
In order to hold on to their precious, unpolished, and, let's be real here, somewhat dated childhood trilogy and try to pass it off as the real Star Wars. Don't get me wrong, preference is fine, but these individuals are just so straight up pathetic and insecure to the nth degree, and actively try to force feed their shallow perception of Star Wars onto others and onto the newer generation in order to gaslight them into buying the bullshit that they are selling out of sheer spite for the creator of Star Wars himself. That being their insistence that the franchise was quote-unquote ruined by anything that came after the quote-unquote childhood trilogy. That is, of course, unless it was just a complete rerun of said childhood and they suddenly drop all of their so-called standards.
Star Wars Episode 7: The Force Awakens. Thank you, J.J. Abrams, for saving Star Wars. George Lucas created Star Wars, and then he destroyed it. Let's be honest with the prequels. But, oh my god, I'm so fucking excited. Go out and see this film right now. Star Wars is back. It's back to its true form. This does the original films justice. Is it better than the original films? No. Is it better than the prequels? 1,000 times. It is so good, guys. Go out and see it.
And these same individuals who were just so offended at how strongly George Lucas, the author, the artist, the creator, resented the theatrical cuts of his movies in hindsight, because despite being well ahead of its time, the childhood trilogy did not represent the extent of his intentions for the Star Wars saga. Hence, in their insecurity, they started a bullshit smear campaign designed to protect their precious childhood, as well as burn both the reputation and legacy of one of humankind's greatest and most accomplished artists to the ground by any and all shameless means necessary. Now, since this is part 3 of the series, mind you, much of what I've just laid out has already been discussed. So for those of you just joining us, much like the Star Wars saga itself, it's strongly recommended you go back to the beginning of the series and watch it in order if you're looking to get the most out of this.
You got to remember, this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
Part 1 of this series was titled The Style of Star Wars, where we discussed how George Lucas made Star Wars, what style of filmmaking and writing he used to construct the saga, and how he kept his style for filmmaking consistent for each and every single one of his Star Wars films, across both the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. It also removes much of the misconceptions around George Lucas as a director and his choices as both an editor and as a writer as well. Part 2 of this series, however, is easily the longest and personally the one that I enjoyed making the most, which discusses, debunks, and negates the many, many lies which have been sickeningly perpetuated ad nauseum about George Lucas by the media and this same collective of Star Wars degenerates over the course of decades, in order to try and destroy his legacy as an artist as well as being the creator and true genius behind the Star Wars franchise. This includes lying about quotes made by several of the actors on the original trilogy and what they were actually referring to, the actors themselves telling misleading accounts of the events that transpired on the making of the Star Wars original trilogy, and members of the Star Wars original trilogy production alumni, namely Marshall Lucas, Irvin Kershner, and Lawrence Kasdan, which in the previous video I labeled, and accurately so, as The Help, actively embellishing their own contributions and input into making what would become the finished version of the Star Wars original trilogy, or even in some cases, just straight up lying about it. That's not to say these individuals didn't offer valuable contributions to the films, just not to the extent which they say that they did, and especially not to the extent that this same collective of assholes so desperately would like you to believe that they did. Some of you might be wondering why I didn't mention Gary Kurtz as being part of The Help. Well, if you watch the earlier videos in this series or read J.W. Rinzler's books, you know that the last thing that lying sack of two-faced shit actually did was help. Matter of fact, he was so incompetent as a producer, failing constantly to rein in Kershner, who was overindulging himself on George Lucas's dollar as his hired director, to the point where Kurtz almost ran the production of Empire Strikes Back and the Star Wars franchise into the ground. And so he basically got fired, and in the years since has only ever given very bitter and contradictory accounts that Star Wars would have been better off if he had still been around to rein in Lucas and quote-unquote challenge him.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
Gary, rest in peace, but if you couldn't even rein in The Help, what hope would you have had in reining in the Lord of the Manor? But I digress. If you want more details on all that, go check out parts 1 and 2. And that said, this video will still dissect and debunk many of the lies surrounding George Lucas by the media, fans, and influencers alike, both about George as a filmmaker and especially as a collaborator. But unlike part 2, which was mainly focused on the original trilogy, part 3 will be focused almost exclusively on the prequel trilogy. How the style of Star Wars carried over from the original trilogy to the prequel trilogy, and how it was maintained, as well as George's methodology and reliance on collaboration when it came to making the films. And by the end, will undisputedly prove this supposed lack of consistency to be a false notion cooked up by a bunch of butthurt, overgrown, tasteless nerds who were just so desperate to sell their fiction instead of facts in order to justify their own shitty and shallow single-digit IQ Star Wars takes, either by the means of their own ignorance or just straight up lying to sway others. Starting with Lucas's collaboration methods between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, while some, but certainly not all, of his collaborators definitely changed between the days of the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, on the other hand, George Lucas's methodology for collaboration as well as his style for directing and filmmaking did not. Which is a sentiment that's also shared by both J.W. Rinzler and Paul Duncan, who are two of the most insightful individuals who could possibly lend a voice into how both trilogies were created and put together through collaboration, and both of whom despise this worthless, quote-unquote, yes-men narrative that disgruntled Gen X Star Wars fanatics first cooked up and has been reinforced through revisionism by certain Star Wars original trilogy alumni members, including but not limited to the likes of Gary Kurtz. And those that they have gaslit into believing it have also propagated long and loud as a means of discrediting George Lucas to justify their disdain for the prequel trilogy.
Episode 1, I'm glad that you're doing a defense of it. I've always thought it was a really good film, and
oh, it is, yeah.
I just could not. Was just utterly baffled by people's, or some people's, and people who I'm friends with. I just don't understand why. What is it that you don't like about this film? I mean, it's got an incredible lightsaber fight, even on a superficial level. It's this unbelievable pod race. What is so bad about this little kid? I just don't get it. I thought he was fine. I mean,
this passionate hatred.
Yeah. It's not bad. That's the thing. That's what I'm going to highlight.
I think there's a lot more now. There's a new generation that grew up with that movie, and I think when people were, if they were 10 years old when it came out, they don't see any difference between that and the original trilogy. Or a lot of them I've even found prefer Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones.
Yeah, I mean, none of the Star Wars films, except maybe the New Hope, is more or less perfect. I mean, I think A New Hope comes pretty close, and probably Empire too. But then the other four films all have enormous flaws, I guess you could point, but they also have enormous assets, and they're assets that are so amazing that they kind of blow other movies out of the water, because when they work, they really work. And yes, there are problems with them, but they're still interesting. And fun.
I don't even think there really are that many problems. I think a lot of it is just like I think a lot of it's just like entitled fans of the original trilogy that basically just want the same thing over and over again, and not really. And it's, I think a lot of times the criticisms are based more on them not getting the films that they wanted, without even really understanding what they want. If that makes sense.
That could be, and when I say, I mean episode 2 and 3 more. Episode 1, I think, is a really good film. I think it's a very good film from start to finish. I think 2 and 3 have more rough spots, let's say, and but I really agree. Sorry,
I said they're really ambitious, so that's part of it.
Yeah, they're really ambitious, and they had less time to do them than they did episode 1, and but whatever, they're all really fantastic films. I think they'll, as long as people are interested in cinema, they'll be interested in those 6 films.
I think there's valid things you could say about all of them, but the where people lose it is when they have this idea that the original trilogy is like this perfect platonic ideal encased in amber, and then somehow before he started the prequels, he just lost his mind and forgot how to make movies at some point in that 10 years there. That's what's really weird to me.
Yeah, no, I don't subscribe to that theory at all. I mean, it's true that Marcia Lucas wasn't around, and she was a great person to have in his, as a person to come in and say, well, this isn't working, or I think this could be better. But he still had a lot of amazing collaborators. Ben Burt is there for all 6. John Williams is there for all 6. Dennis Muren is there for most of them. I think maybe he wasn't on episode 3, but correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, they're such an amazing crew, and George,
is in the same league there, because what they're doing is it means that everything they do comes completely from them, from their own life story, their own life history, their own philosophy. And so really, George is a complete auteur, and should be recognized as such, I think.
Yeah, definitely. But also willing to collaborate, like you were just saying, because that's one of the crazy things I always see from people that don't like the prequels or don't like Lucas, is they have this idea that he was surrounded by yes men and that all his coworkers were afraid of him. I asked Rensler about that, and he just started laughing, because Rensler actually worked with him for years. Sure. But if you actually talk to anybody who works
the same, I think that's I asked something like that, I think, to Doug or I think some others as well. I think it was Doug who said, Doug Chang, he says, people only said yes when the cameras were on.
Right. And they just said, especially the art department, they just say it was open season. We could do anything. It was the most creative job they ever had, Yeah,
it's, again, it's marketing,
Right.
I mean, the reality of the situation is often different. So I'm trying to, in the books, I'm trying to give a more realistic view of it. And also there's, I think people, they fail to realize that George does have final say on everything in the movies.
Yeah.
So they are his movies completely.
But it's absurd to say that the editors saved George because George was the one in editorial.
Yeah.
And he's a fantastic editor. I mean, I saw him with my own eyes on episode 3, and he was there every day with Ben Burt and the second editor, Roger Barton, I think was. I hope I'm not getting that wrong.
Yeah, I think
so I mean, every single day for hours. So, of course, they're making. Nobody could show the raw footage they shot on a set and just the way they shot it and call it a movie. It's just not a movie. It's hours, 10 times too long on average.
And especially with George Lucas, he said a million times that editing is the part he likes best. That's where he's most creative. That's the whole thing for him. He's not really that into the on-set part of it, right? I mean,
right. He definitely suffers during the on-set part.
Yeah, he looks like he's in pain.
Yeah.
But, Justin, did you have a?
Yeah. I was going to say about when he's on set. This brings me to another anti-Lucas myth that's propagated on the internet. At least I believe it's a myth. That being that he surrounded himself with yes men, and that nobody ever challenged any of his opinions or viewpoints on set.
So that's a red letter media thing that you guys were terrified to talk back to him and that he wouldn't listen to you. What would you say about that?
Well, on any set, the director is the boss,
right? And
you can't make a movie if you start arguing with the director about what he's supposed to be doing, you'll be fired instantly. 9 times out of 10, unless there's a really good reason for it. So some directors are more collaborative on set. They want to get ideas. Robert Altman is famous for that. But I saw when that was different. But George is just basically has his own style on set, but certainly people could make suggestions. There was no autocratic. I mean, I was there for a month on episode 3 and for all of the pickups. There certainly wasn't autocratic. If somebody had a suggestion, the actors, could make it. And then of course, during the whole lead up to filming on episode 3, the artists were doing nothing but making suggestions. That's what concept art is. It was thousands and thousands of suggestions. And of course, George said, he would say, I need this for next week, but it was very broad.
Now, while we're discussing the wealth of actual insight that Paul Duncan possesses, it's worth bringing up that one of the typical ilk of Twitter professors coming from this same vacuous, shallow, and pathetic collective of Star Wars morons who don't have a bone of insight or talent for that matter in their bodies, yet still act like fucking film experts who pretend to know what the supposed problems were with George Lucas's prequel trilogy, and how they could have saved the films had their worthless fanboy advice been heeded. Oh, if only George Lucas hadn't been so blinded by ambition and ego and just listened to this moronic cesspool of idiots in his fan base. Oh, how Star Wars could have been saved.
Stop!
But that's okay, because Disney listened to them.
Now that we have the prequels existing, they're like, we know what not to do. Let's not do that again. Let's do something else and make it the way it should be.
And well, yeah. Setting aside the fact that you'll soon see that billionaire entrepreneur, filmmaking pioneer trained by Francis Ford Coppola and creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, had in fact sought out plenty of filmmakers and experts to provide him constructive feedback which would benefit his films. But when one of the supposed geniuses of the people versus George Lucas's best and brightest goes up against the likes of an actual expert like Paul Duncan, who had far more access to the vault of behind-the-scenes information on Star Wars than anyone else, with the exception of J.W. Rinsler and, of course, George Lucas himself. You see how this collective of wannabe film professors go from this smug collective of self-deluded pseudo-intellectuals, which, you know, they are, and are quickly reduced into looking like complete jackasses with nary a shred of intelligence or a single coherent argument outside of what they assumed, simply based on negative feelings they felt from watching the films that didn't rerun their childhood, or simply believed from what they heard from someone else who had a chip on their shoulder from not having their childhood rerun, and also knew nothing about Star Wars or how it was made. After tweeting an excerpt from his book, Paul Duncan is confronted by this individual who goes on to say, "Lucas is such a fascinating character. He seems to do best as the outsider ideas generator working in a collegiate environment with supporting peers who can either shoot him down or follow through and implement his ideas for him. He fails when he tries to do it all himself."
That's a good one.
Paul Duncan then cuts him off by just laying out what we already know. Lucas has always collaborated. You cannot be a filmmaker without collaborating with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. How do you measure failure? Lucas may have a different system to you for measuring the success or failure of a project. This idiot goes on and immediately takes the classic route of referring to the prequel trilogy as quote-unquote evidence for his point, saying, quote, "Take the prequel trilogy, rich in ideas, a fascinating concept. Lucas had complete autonomy and power in making that trilogy, and there were no individuals who could quote-unquote challenge his vision. Result, a flawed series with pacing issues. Contrast that with the OT, where actors, fellow directors, friends, and Lucas's own wife, can't resist bringing up the whole Marsha Lucas narrative, which is textbook for these assholes at this point, just not in any of the textbooks that actually fucking matter. They all made significant contributions to the structure of the films. Lucas really works better when trusted peers can challenge him and execute his ideas when they think he's wrong." Now, we've already discussed at length both the making of Star Wars and the making of Empire Strikes Back, which completely spits in the face of that nonsense because Lucas had complete autonomy over all of the movies, as we all well know. This clown seems to be clinging to that piece of shit quote given by Gary Kurtz, which we briefly touched on. And Gary Kurtz, of course, projecting like a motherfucker, was the ultimate yes man on the original trilogy. But neither he nor the help could tell Lucas what the fuck to do on those movies either. So this complete autonomy he's referring to is absolute horseshit as the supposed reason for the quote-unquote flaws of the prequels, because guess what? That complete autonomy was there on the original trilogy as well.
But that's not what they would have you believe.
The actors made it work, the editors made it work, the art department, made it work. And he had the ideas, and then they're like, you created everything. I think the prequels do kind of prove that his ultimate decision-making process is horribly flawed.
As Paul Duncan then goes on to shove the facts right in this motherfucker's face, saying, quote, "You are repeating the myth that the OT is good because George was controlled by others, and the prequel trilogy is bad because George had complete control." The author of the Star Wars archives is calling this horse shit a myth, alright? If he's calling it a myth, it's a fucking myth, okay?
End of story. Bye-bye. See you later.
But as we're about to see, that's still not enough for these assholes. They must cling to their fiction at all costs. Paul Duncan goes on, saying George had complete control of all of the movies and collaborated with everybody. So give him credit whether you like or dislike his work.
And the truth shall set you free!
In other words, you don't get to say the OT is good because of other people and the prequel trilogy is supposedly crap because of George Lucas. It's either all or none. They're all his movies, like it or fucking not. This individual then backpedals a little bit, but then, of course, has to double down, saying, "I give Lucas tremendous credit. He is a visionary. However, I'm suggesting that collaboration works best for Lucas when he works alongside those who will robustly challenge him." That challenge was present on the original trilogy, not the prequel trilogy. I don't regard it as a myth. It seems self-evident, frankly. In other words, he's proven right solely for the fact that he didn't like the movies. So it had to be other people, not Lucas, bringing the magic for the childhood trilogy, right?
No!
Paul Duncan then immediately gives the correct response in saying, "What facts do you have? I've gone through all the paperwork for all 6 movies and transcripts of meetings and story conferences. There is no difference between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. The only difference is people's reactions to the movies." Now, you'd think that would be the end of the argument, right? You'd think that when the author of the Star Wars Archives, who's interviewed George Lucas, interviewed production crew members, editors, alumni, the whole shebang, and has seen all the behind-the-scenes material, is telling you your fucking argument is idiotic and wrong, and not based in logic or facts, that would be the end of it, right? No, this guy keeps on digging. Instead, these clowns do what they always do. They double down, triple down, and when they can't nudge you anymore, they'll try to use regurgitated comments or quotes that they heard from somewhere else, basically the grown-up version of plugging your ears and mouthing off, in order to delusionally carry themselves as the winner. He replies to Paul Duncan saying, "Blimey, Squire, I didn't realize I had to come armed with receipts." And I mean, isn't that telling? Where he can just mouth off complete bullshit about George Lucas, acting like he's speaking facts and not fiction, and he doesn't feel like he has to prove anything he says, because he doesn't expect to get called out for it. And when he does get called out for it, he has to keep clinging to his bullshit fucking fiction at all costs, because he can't allow himself to accept the fact that he's been mouthing off a lie all this time. He goes on to say, "My point is a narrow one. Lucas works better with peer collaborators who tell him when he's wrong rather than collaborators who defer to him on every point." Dipshit, your point isn't a narrow one, it's a fucking non-existent one.
It's not fucking real.
And he goes on to tweet 2 screen caps which look to have been assembled together on Reddit, most likely. The almighty cesspool of wannabe experts online. The quote on the left is common knowledge that Brian De Palma and Jay Cox helped Lucas rework the opening crawl for the first Star Wars film. That is, of course, before George Lucas then reworked it again himself.
According to Steven Spielberg, De Palma inspired the new crawl, which gave the audience some kind of story geography. Brian was the one who actually sat down and helped me fix the roll-up, he and Jay Cox, Lucas says. The next day, we rewrote the roll-up. Brian dictated it to Jay, he typed it up, and it got rewritten a couple of times after. And finally, the crawl was evidently one of the last shots completed for the film. 3 weeks before release means nearly 3 months after De Palma's rewrite, and it was reshot several times. Either way, the crawl in the finished film is not De Palma's rewrite of the third draft crawl, but rather Lucas's rewrite of De Palma's rewrite of Lucas's rewrite of his rewrite of the third draft crawl.
The quote on the right is also one of the most bizarrely regurgitated quotes taken from Rick McCallum, who was producer on both the Star Wars prequels, the remastered cuts of Star Wars, and also the Young Indiana Jones television series. The quote in question, which of course these people take out of context, is when he says,
"It's so dense, every single image has so many things going on."
And these same clowns like to flaunt this quote around like it's some kind of blatant admission of guilt. Which, I mean, firstly, in this case, I don't know how McCallum's quote is even remotely comparable to the other quote. That's why I assume this moron just took it haphazardly from Reddit, from yet another idiot who didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
Yeah, no, you're not a complete jackass, yeah.
And secondly, just a side note here, but I fail to see how this quote, even out of context, is any kind of meaningful criticism of the prequel films. See, the gist of their spin on McCallum's quote is that the prequels were so overly dense with computer effects that the movies lose their emotional punch, as well as the environments and the characters supposedly looking fake as a result. Pretending, of course, that people posing as aliens in rubber masks, who can barely act or express any kind of emotion, or even an incredibly well-designed, albeit limited puppet, who can also barely move and barely emote or act, is supposedly more real, as opposed to the CGI characters in the prequels that could actually move, emote, and act. Like, this is just some of the most outdated, out of touch, useless fucking takes on Star Wars that a person can have. Like, CGI was the new kid on the block back in the 90s and early 2000s. Like, we're in the 2020s, and people are still pulling the CGI is fake card. Which, given the current year, is the very embodiment of the old man yells at cloud meme, because that's precisely where most of this horse shit is still coming from. But the succulent irony behind this is that the prequels had more practical effects and models and miniatures and just the Phantom Menace than the entire original trilogy combined, and some of the environments were only digital in the prequels and not the original trilogy because the technology was just incredibly limited at the time. It's the very reason George Lucas had to scale back his ideas and ambition tremendously whilst creating the original trilogy, yet still managed to push the technology to its absolute limits, making the original trilogy potentially decades ahead of its time.
No one had done it before, and you had to do it on your own.
Because I had a story to tell.
Yeah.
There is a gap between what is possible and where my vision is, and I've had to fill that gap, which is what anybody does. You don't invent technology and then figure out what to do with it. You come up with an artistic problem, and then you have to invent the technology in order to accomplish it. So it's the opposite of what most people think it is, and any artist will tell you that. And art, on all levels, is just technology.
And that's exactly what happened with the prequels as well. Now back to McCallum's quote, the reason it's always baffled me that people can even remotely turn this into a criticism of the prequels, or any kind of admission of guilt on McCallum's part, that the emotional core of those films is diminished due to a supposed density in computer imagery and effects. Personally, I consider this a positive, if anything. Here is an example of a shot that's quote-unquote so dense, there's so many things going on. And here's another one. And here's another one. The reason I say the density of these shots are and have always been an asset to Star Wars is not only due to the immersion factor, but due to the fact that you can always pick up something new, as I will ably demonstrate. Look, there's a Gungan and a droid fighting over a blaster.
Wow! What do you know?
Oh look, there's a Jedi doing a commando roll in the background.
Wow! What do you know?
Oh look, there's the Millennium Falcon.
Wow! What do you know?
You know what scenes this doesn't happen in? Where the density of the shots is toned down? It's shots like this.
Promise me you will train the boy.
Yes, master.
And I failed to see the density of this shot, sapping the emotional core of this scene.
I'm so proud of you, honey. I missed you.
And hell, where's the quote, so many things going on, that diminishes this scene?
You were my brother, Anakin! I loved you!
So yeah, keep all that in mind the next time some moron tries to use this quote from Rick McCallum to discredit the prequels, including this idiot who thinks it even vaguely pertains to the point he's trying to make against Paul Duncan, when in actuality, he's just spouting utter nonsense. Anyway, Paul Duncan responds by closing him down with, quote, well, so much is hearsay, and I like to deal in facts. All those old friends and collaborators who had input on the OT, and some did uncredited dialogue polishes, also got to see and comment on the prequel trilogy. And likewise, dialogue got polished by Carrie Fisher and others as well. End quote.
Can you feel that? Huh? Can you feel it?
Damn, does it feel good to be on the right side of Star Wars history. It doesn't get any more clear cut and dry than that. Thank you, Mr. Paul Duncan. To all those of you who have pushed this narrative for decades, go ahead, cope, seethe, pout, bargain with yourselves. It doesn't matter. Your whole fiction of how Star Wars was made and supposedly fell apart because George Lucas supposedly lost his way after the original trilogy by not collaborating with The Help and only having complete control over the prequel trilogy and not the original trilogy is absolutely dead, soon to be buried and lost to time. Just accept that you had a really dumb rationale for why you didn't like the prequels, say that you either had to lie to discredit them or parroted someone else's dumb take due to your own willful ignorance, and we can move on. That said, the next part of this video will heavily elaborate on how George Lucas collaborated on the prequels, as well as address much of the misconceptions surrounding those films, their production process, improvisation, casting, editing, rough cut screenings, and of course, the dialogue aspect of them, and how all of these elements consistently tie in with how the original trilogy was made. More specifically, in regards to the directing, the biggest difference on that account is the fact that George Lucas simply had more time and resources to work with that he simply did not possess for his earlier films, where he was also, in fact, the director. Hence, he didn't have to speed through principal photography in order to make the deadline.
The final scenes were filmed at breakneck speed, with Lucas frantically bicycling from one soundstage to another.
Which you'd be hard-pressed to scrape together any kind of explanation for how that could possibly work towards the film's detriment. While we're on the subject of George Lucas's directing style, that he describes in his own words as a very improvisational style of directing, and according to Rinsler's book, he allowed many ad-libbed moments from the actors to make it into the final cut of A New Hope.
Take a few moments to get the coordinates from the navigator.
Prisoner transfer from cell block 1138.
Lucas wanted the actors to focus on performing to each other more so than performing to the camera, and so he gave them plenty of breathing room in order to allow them to work their craft, which undeniably ended up paying dividends. So, did George Lucas allow the same kind of freedom for ad-libbed moments and or improvisation in the Star Wars prequel films?
No. Yes.
Yes, you bet your ass he did. Let's start with something small, such as this instance in The Phantom Menace during the Duel of the Fates, where Obi-Wan is about to fight Darth Maul one-on-one after Qui-Gon Jinn is mortally wounded. It's well documented how passionate Ewan McGregor and Ray Park were when rehearsing the lightsaber fights, so when Ewan McGregor is bobbing up and down trying to psych himself up for the next take, this wasn't actually part of the scene. But George Lucas decided to keep it in the final cut of the film because he recognized it would work better for the sequence. Obi-Wan was eager to fight Darth Maul, and the fact that his master was just beaten by this mysterious Sith warrior would understandably leave the Jedi apprentice very much on edge.
There's also a wonderful little moment right before the electron beam opens. Ewan, he's just sort of anticipating the door's about to open, and he's sort of bouncing up and down a little bit. That wasn't directed. That was just what Ewan was doing to kind of psych himself up for the take about to start. But George liked it so much that he included that in there.
Hell, let's tackle something a little bigger, shall we? Jar Jar Binks. Now, it's fairly common knowledge that Ahmed Best, the actor who portrayed Jar Jar Binks, was unfairly chastised by an extremely vocal minority of individuals from both the Star Wars fandom and the media, who disliked his character for being obnoxious and annoying. Setting aside the fact that Jar Jar was meant to be the character that didn't fit in anywhere, and was even an outcast to his own people for those very same reasons,
my friend might have been banished. You know, I find that Jar Jar creature to be a little odd.
Don't do that again.
Why do I sense we've picked up another pathetic life form?
You're quite right. He's very odd indeed.
Not to mention the fact that he was a weapon of mass self-destruction.
Why were you banished, Jar Jar?
Miss, clumsy.
You were banished because you were clumsy.
Mightn't be saying that.
Now, given the fact that it's been 2 decades and cooler heads have prevailed, people agree that the backlash Ahmed Best received was undeserved, and side note here, but the narrative has swayed to solely blaming the media for the actor's mental health issues, because the actor mentioned in a later interview that it was the media's comments about his acting and his character, and not comments that came directly from the Jar Jar detractors that caused him to contemplate suicide. Jake Lloyd, the actor who portrayed young Anakin Skywalker, also suffered from mental health issues, in the later years after The Phantom Menace released, and in a recent interview given by his mother, similarly to Ahmed Best, she insisted that the backlash mainly came from the media, and Jake was minimally exposed to backlash coming directly from fans, even though there are several accounts given by Lloyd himself that do more than just a little to contradict that. But that aside, the new narrative by detractors of the prequels, which used to be, "It's not our fault they deserved it, they sucked." But now that some new light has been shed on what these actors have had to go through since the movies came out, they have since flip-flopped, and the narrative has since become, "See, we didn't do anything, it was just the media being jerks." And now the general consensus is to not blame the actors because it was all Lucas's fault. Because their terrible performances and characters should all be lumped on George Lucas's shoulders. Putting a pin in that for just a moment, the problem with trying to pass off the backlash by insisting it mainly came from the media and not a fanatical group of Star Wars degenerates from back in the late 90s, early 2000s, is also a double-edged sword by undermining another narrative and outright admitting it was simply a vocal minority of fanatical individuals that outright hated the prequels, and not the vast majority of fans as these same people love to claim.
10 loved it, 7 liked it or thought it was okay, and 2 are no longer Star Wars fans.
So there's that.
But to these individuals trying to pass off the embarrassing level of backlash that actors portraying a simple, optimistic, and somewhat gifted 9-year-old boy and a cartoon rabbit received as just being a product of the media, in the very same interview with Empire magazine in 1999 that people like to cherry pick in order to discredit George Lucas, when he was directly questioned about the extremely loud fan backlash levied at Jar Jar Binks, George Lucas made it crystal clear that it was simply a vocal minority online of disgruntled 30 or 40-something-year-olds crying a bitch fit, reeing into the void. They might put up a blog or an article, but they are simply singular individuals expressing an opinion. And obviously, the bombastic nature of their comments might grant them some attention, as they were designed to do, but these singular individuals do not come even close to speaking for the vast majority of fans who went to see the movies. And given the time of which this interview came out, I think we should all be inclined to agree, since the prequels predate social media, viral posting, and influence. But the reason these losers were getting any kind of mainstream attention was due to the shitty-ass media outlets with their own agenda giving those parasites a much louder voice. Ergo, to those scumbags out there trying to deflect their ridiculous, petulant outrage at 2 of probably the most wholesome aspects of The Phantom Menace, you can't blame the media for the backlash the actors received without also pointing the fingers at yourselves. But nice try, I guess. Point I'm getting at is when it comes to this new trend of wrapping cotton wool around the actors and shifting the blame towards Lucas for how the characters were portrayed, or how some will just flip-flop constantly for actors they like, saying that the actors did a good job and that Lucas simply let them down or gave them crappy material to work with, which is yet another bizarre narrative people like to spin, and I'll come back to it later, because these individuals will move heaven and earth to simply avoid the very simple and correct action of giving Lucas credit for the things they actually like. But when it came to improvisation on the prequels, in the case of Jar Jar Binks and how he was portrayed, as it turns out, George Lucas actually gave Ahmed Best all the freedom he could have possibly wanted to improvise the mannerisms of Jar Jar Binks and inject as much of his own personality into the character as he wanted, so long as it met the guidelines that Lucas had set.
Oh no! In terms of Jar Jar's performance, it really all started with Ahmed Best.
He would play the scene with the actors. So I blocked it out and I directed the actors and Ahmed the way I wanted the scene to be played. I hired Ahmed because he is very physical and he can act with his body. You kind of come over here next to the Jedi.
Ahmed's performance was really a reference.
Oh, but it is demanded by the god.
It's our first introduction to Jar Jar on the show. And Jar Jar, of course, was all computer graphics in the show. and it was quite a challenge to get it. We're lucky to have Amon Best, who is a terrific actor who was shot as a sort of as a reference, but a lot more than a reference. He established a lot of the character and everything of Jar Jar, and then we shot a take without him and let the animators and Rob go to work on giving him the Jar Jar personality and all.
So is this where these same people are going to flip-flop again and say Ahmed Best all of a sudden deserved the backlash after all because he actually did have a heavy collaborative hand in crafting the character that they didn't like? Yeah, why don't you backpedal now, motherfucker? Now, I'll have plenty more to say about the backlash pertaining to Ahmed Best and Jake Lloyd later on. Not just because there's an incredible amount of misinformation pertaining to that topic alone, but also because it's one of the most blatant examples of media and fanboy flip-flopping and hypocrisy flaunted in the public eye that I've ever seen. Hell, Simon Pegg, who I've cited, being a rare case pertaining to both those demographics. I only mentioned the backlash in this section because the softening of the vitriol levied against the actors in The Phantom Menace has been replaced by some of those same people with even more vitriol levied against George Lucas as the director who supposedly didn't allow his actors any freedom to improvise and instead suffocated their creative prowess by his need to control them. And as a result, they suffered because of his supposed lack of talent as a director, when nothing could be further from the truth.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
Which was that the actors absolutely had a hand in crafting the mannerisms of the characters and their performances, including, and perhaps even more so, in the characters that this very same collective of know-nothing degenerates didn't like for the most shallow and pathetic reasons imaginable. So yeah, Jar Jar, like many of the characters in the Star Wars saga, including the prequels, was a product of healthy collaboration between the writer-director and the added improvisational contributions of the actor. So what else did Lucas allow the actors to improvise?
Mi boska da Shmi Skywalker.
Yeah, you know that Tatooine dialogue that mostly sounds like gibberish? I think the official term is Huttonese. Well, it turns out that George Lucas allowed Hayden Christensen free rein to craft his very own lines in Huttonese. Again, under very broad guidelines that Lucas himself set for him. For the Tatooine scenes in Attack of the Clones, which Hayden Christensen admitted to in a fairly recent interview.
Chat wara. Ting mi chasa hopa.
So, any other examples of George Lucas allowing his actors the artistic freedom to improvise?
I don't think George was satisfied with the dialogue he had written because he told Hayden and I to just improvise, which was amusing because, of course, it got inappropriate very quickly. But it was a fun scene to shoot, although we felt pretty stupid, biting fake fruit, which didn't exist out of the air.
No, it couldn't be. Certainly not the awkward romance in Attack of the Clones that Lucas totally didn't have a co-writer who assisted him with the script, foreshadowing,
That's impossible!
And for which George Lucas totally didn't spend his earlier years getting inspired by Gone with the Wind, Dr. Zhivago, and old-fashioned 40s romances and film noir in order to design the romance for the script.
There's a paragraph in Kaminsky's book where he tries to drag Lucas for his supposedly awful dialogue, and it's the perfect microcosm of how myopic this way of thinking is. He scrutinizes a line from an early draft of the Empire Strikes Back screenplay written by Lucas, in which Han says to Leia, "Don't worry, I'm not going to kiss you here. You see, I'm quite selfish about my pleasure, and it wouldn't be much fun for me now." Shades of Attack of the Clones, Kaminsky says. Had this been filmed, critics might be lashing the poor scripting of Empire, but somehow Empire ended up evolving into another first-rate screenplay. How did that happen? How did lightning not only strike twice, but arguably produce a better crafted script than the original? The answer comes with the relinquishing of control Lucas enacted, allowing his screenplay draft to be transformed into something far beyond any abilities he had on his own.
Wow, Kaminsky and the not-so-secret simping of Marsha Lucas criticizing a line from one of George Lucas's earlier drafts as a means of discrediting his writing ability, which according to The Help, was never meant to be the finished script?
Who could have predicted this?
Just like the clowns who cite Mark Hamill and Alec Guinness as quote-unquote saving A New Hope, from George Lucas's writing when they themselves were referring to a much older draft of the script, and also dialogue that they were merely screen testing, some of which that didn't even belong to their own character.
I remember there was one line that I just begged him to take out of the screenplay, and he finally did. And my line was, "But we can't turn back."
Fear is their greatest defense. Here, I doubt if the actual security there is much greater than on Aquilae or Sullus, and what there is most likely directed towards a large scale assault.
Who talks like this?
But please, do go on.
Since Kaminsky purports to be uncovering the secrets of Star Wars history, you'd think he'd have realized that Lucas was copying a line from Gone with the Wind, and this is by no means the only instance of Lucas lifting lines from that book for Han and Leia's dialogue. This becomes significant in the context of examining the original trilogy and comparing it to the prequels, as Kaminsky is trying to do, because Lucas uses a similar process of homaging a great romance novel in Attack of the Clones, taking many of Anakin and Padme's interactions from Dr. Zhivago. This isn't really secret history, even. It's right there on the posters.
Occasionally, maybe, when you aren't acting like a scoundrel.
You like me because I'm a scoundrel.
I happen to like nice men.
My heart is beating, hoping that that kiss will not become a scar. You are in my very soul, tormenting me.
I truly, deeply love you.
So if one finds themselves responding differently to the love story in the prequel trilogy than they did to its counterpart in the original trilogy, that's a valid initial reaction to have, but from there, if one wishes, they can examine the dialogue a bit and compare it to the sources of inspiration that Lucas used, and upon doing that, they'll understand that it was the same creative process that led to both stories. One might then see the films in a new light and appreciate his art more. Kaminsky takes the first step of doing this with his singling out this line, but the full thought process I just outlined here necessitates that one acknowledges that maybe Lucas knows something they don't. Kaminsky doesn't do that.
And just as a little added freebie, in Rinzler's Making of Star Wars book, Chapter 6, that discusses all the changes that Lucas made when he wrote the fourth draft script of A New Hope that, remember, none of the cast had screen tested with.
Then I started reading, and it seemed to me the dialogue was pretty ropey.
When the book details the major changes that were made for both budgetary and creative reasons, such as cutting the scenes from Alderaan, and instead having the bulk of the film take place on the Death Star, Rinzler's book details what Lucas's broad ideas for the possible second and third Star Wars film could be. And here's what George Lucas had to say. Quote, "I want to have Luke kiss the princess in the second book. The second book will be Gone with the Wind in outer space."
Wow! What do you know?
She likes Luke, but Han is Clark Gable. Well, she may appear to get Luke, because in the end I want Han to leave. Han splits at the end of the second book, and we learn who Darth Vader is. In the third book, I want the story to be about the soap opera of the Skywalker family, which ends with the destruction of the Empire.
But wait! There's more!
Then someday I want to do the backstory of Kenobi as a young man, a story of the Jedi and how the Emperor eventually takes over and turns the whole thing from a republic into an empire, and tricks all the Jedi and kills them. The whole battle where Luke's father gets killed? That would be impossible to do, but it's great to dream about. End fucking quote.
Yes! Yes! Oh, yeah! Can you feel that, buddy? Huh? Huh? Huh?
Now, obviously, this doesn't mean Lucas had everything figured out from the very beginning, and before you open your mouth and start chastising Lucas for changing and or evolving some ideas along the way, not just in the original trilogy, understand, but the prequels as well, if you think Harry Potter, A Song of Ice and Fire, and Lord of the Rings were all 100% planned out right away from the very start, then you're completely out of your fucking mind. The point is, George Lucas was documented as having already planned incredibly far ahead for the Star Wars saga. From as early back as December 29th, 1975, the day this interview took place, during the late pre-production stage of Star Wars A New Hope, and most of which would remain unchanged until he finished Revenge of the Sith in 2005. I often see many people, even Lucas's detractors, hail him as a visionary.
Society only tolerates one change at a time. The first time I tried to change the world, I was hailed as a visionary. Second time, I was asked politely to retire. So here I am, enjoying my retirement.
Yet they refuse to admit that in addition to planning out his business and financial endeavors, he yet somehow didn't have the foresight to plan out the very thing he was most passionate about.
Really makes you think.
Moving on to the consistent style of Star Wars that was carried over from the original trilogy to the prequel trilogy, what about the silent film storytelling aspect of Star Wars that was built into the very foundations of the original films? Was this same silent film style also utilized to the same or to an even greater extent in the prequel trilogy? You know what? In the spirit of visual storytelling, I'm not going to answer that with words. I'm just going to play a little ambient music and show the following clips.
Checkmate.
Next up, what about the documentary style of camera work that George Lucas utilized for the original trilogy, and that he insisted be utilized for the latter two original trilogy films as well? Did that also carry over to the prequel trilogy?
One of the things that I'm doing in these films is to give it a little bit of realities, to give the shots a kind of documentary feel where things float off the shot. I don't really put people in the center, and I let them sort of drift around in the frame a little bit more than you normally do in a movie. This is especially true in this scene here, as she goes up the ramp, where Jar Jar goes almost completely off the camera. And then as Anakin and R2 approach, well, Jar Jar's an animated character. I can put him wherever I want. But I purposely put him way off the side of the screen there. It just gives you the sense that it wasn't, just staged perfectly for the camera, that things are kind of caught. They aren't perfect. It actually happened, that Jar Jar was actually there. And I actually had to frame him, but I didn't, because he wasn't there.
Okay, so we can add another check. Let's see what's next on the list. Silent film storytelling, documentary camera work and cinematography, improvisational acting and directing style, debunking that stupid yes men narrative. Ah yes, the rough cut screenings, there we go. Right, so you know how the first rough cut of the original Star Wars was an absolute disaster, and which again is incredibly common with rough cut screenings?
If you don't get physically ill seeing your first rough cut, something's wrong.
Lucas was shocked when he saw the first assembly of his edited film that spring. The first cut of Star Wars was an unmitigated disaster.
I'd started to see things cut together. I wasn't happy with it. I'd come in on weekends and I'd recut the film on my own. And I tried to get the editor to cut it my way, and he didn't really want to, and so I had to let the editor go. So I had no editor. I was behind schedule. I had to race to finish the movie.
Lucas realized his only hope was to start from scratch.
And you know how initially everyone thought the original movie would fail, and how it was met with similar, albeit mixed reactions, with several other subsequent rough cut screenings, and eventually George Lucas showed certain studio executives who actually loved what they saw.
And on the other hand, the studio, when Laddie and his little group saw the film, they loved it. It's the first time I've actually shown a film, and one of the executives even cried at the screening. It was like, very emotional for him.
Say the most extraordinary day of my life has just taken place, and I want you to remember this day, because this is what I never dreamed, or maybe I dreamed, but I never thought I would have a day's experience like the day I've had today in seeing this film.
But most of George Lucas's friends, who he sought for feedback, and who were far more educated on how filmmaking works, that saw the same rough cut, all thought the movie was awful, with the exception of Steven Spielberg.
It was an early stage, sort of a second or third cut. I had a couple of my friends come up to see it. Brian De Palma was in town, Steven came, some other friends came to see it.
So the reaction was not a good one. I loved the movie. I was probably one of the only people in the audience that liked the movie.
Some of my friends were very honest. I don't get it. It's kind of, what are you doing here? So that was basically the tenor of the whole thing.
And then George Lucas took advice based on that feedback to improve the movie, and then he passed the movie off to his quote-unquote 3 genius editors to be saved from his awful rough cut.
This disastrous cut of the film, to which Lucas's friends reacted so badly, was in fact edited by Marcia Lucas, Richard Chew, and Paul Hirsch.
Well, as it turns out, and this might blow your mind if you've spent the majority of your life drinking the internet Kool-Aid, this rough cut screening process is something that George Lucas has used for every single one of his Star Wars movies. Yes, including the ones that supposedly quote-unquote ruined their childhood. Hell, why don't we start with The Empire Strikes Back, who many of these same dipshits love to label as the quote-unquote bestest one, who seem to be under the impression that Kirshner just shat out a masterpiece on his first try, along with Kasdan and Brackett's script, while Marshall Lucas was doing the hard yards in the editing room and George Lucas was just on a beach somewhere, snorting blow and banging hookers.
That's a good one.
See, when Kirshner finished principal photography on The Empire Strikes Back and the first rough cut was assembled, the reaction was, more or less, what you'd expect. Everyone thought it was terrible. No, not the bestest Star Wars movie. That couldn't have had a disastrous rough cut.
It's not true. That's impossible.
After all, Kirshner was saving Empire Strikes Back from George Lucas, right?
No!
Now, returning to Rinsler's book, The Making of The Empire Strikes Back, and an excerpt where Steve Starkey, one of the assistant film editors on Empire Strikes Back, and who has gone on to produce many well-received and widely recognized films, he describes what sitting through the first rough cut was like. Quote, "This was the first time I attended a rough cut screening. I watched this movie at Parkhouse and I came out and I was confused. What is this? It's a mess. The fights in space and stuff were just black and white scratchy things representing gunfire and planes. It was hard to even make sense of it, let alone emotionally know if the edit was correct. And we should move forward on this huge movie. I remember walking home with Ben Burt. We were walking off our steam because we had been working night and day to make this screening deadline date. And he just said, quote, 'Look, Steve, I was there on Star Wars, and it's probably feeling really rough to you. But I promise you, this has all the goods. This movie is working.' End quote. Ben Burt, of course, having been a strong presence and collaborator on every single George Lucas Star Wars film, being the sound designer of the original Star Wars trilogy, as well as fulfilling the same role as well as being the official editor on the prequel trilogy. And speaking of which, did the prequel trilogy have any disastrous rough cuts just like The Empire Strikes Back?
Yes!
And was Ben Burt present on those same rough cut screenings?
Yes!
In a space of about 90 seconds, you go from lamenting the death of, a hero to escape, to slightly comedic with Jar Jar, to Anakin returning with his little kind of tag. It's a lot, and it's a very short time.
We had this ending cut lots of different ways. In a lot of my movies, I end them with the intercutting of 3 or 4 different events at the same time. So it came out of American Graffiti, where I was telling 4 stories and intercutting them, and now I've developed this idea of challenging myself to see how many stories I can tell simultaneously at the end of the movie. I think I've slowed down on it a little bit, but this was very challenging in that there were, trying to get the balance right between the stories. And then coming up with little humorous pieces for Jar Jar to exploit the fact that he's a bumbler, but at the same time make his bumbling be the thing that helps turn the tide of the battle for the Gungans, even though they don't win the battle. Anakin and Jar Jar are both playing the same note in this, which is they're kind of bumbling their way through and coming out heroes.
After her!
This sequence was changed around a little bit because the Nemoidians get captured in this scene, and I sort of finished off the scene, and then later I took the end of the scene, rewrote it, and put it outside at the very end of the movie. So I moved it down further because there's still so much going on here that it didn't seem appropriate for it to happen during this environment. It needed to be separated and put out and get a more sense of completion. And again, intercutting these whole sequences and who succeeded and in what order, this has all been changed around several different times. It seems very obvious now, but when you have 4 endings, basically, you have to figure out which ending is the most important ending and save that one for last, which is this one and the most shocking, really, which is Darth Maul getting cut in half. And you make that the last ending.
Now, in particular, when it comes to the Phantom Menace, the most infamous example of a rough cut screening is this small snippet showcased in the Phantom Menace documentary, which many Star Wars fans have cited as quote-unquote evidence of the film being a supposed disaster. Some of these same idiotic fans were actually so delusional and or incapable of applying any kind of logic, seem to either forget or deliberately ignore the fact that, again, this was a rough cut screening, meaning not a representation of the final cut of the film, much like the rough cuts on the original Star Wars film in Empire Strikes Back, the perfect ones that were saved from George. And some hilariously seem to be under the impression that the camera was snuck into this private screening or something, and the footage was secretly placed into the DVD of the Phantom Menace in an attempt to try and warn fans about how supposedly bad the Phantom Menace was. And not like George intended people to see it in order to try and educate the public on what an arduous task making movies is behind the scenes or something. I wish I was joking, but that's how fucking stupid this collective of dipshits actually is. And as a result, several now infamous quotes from Lucas have been constantly used as ammunition against the Phantom Menace and constantly referenced out of context as quote-unquote evidence of Lucas not knowing how to make movies, apparently.
If you don't get physically ill seeing your first rough cut, something's wrong.
Those lines in question being,
I may have gone too far in a few places.
And of course,
it's stylistically designed to be that way, and you can't undo that, but we can diminish the effects of it.
That second quote is often laughed at and made fun of as George supposedly talking nonsense. But that style is precisely what the fundamentals of this entire fucking franchise has been based on for the past 40 years, as well as being the premise for this multi-hour video, and began by making reference to Lucas himself describing both the style and how certain fans and the media constantly showcase their stupidity, and despite claiming to be experts, seemingly not having a fucking clue about the style or where it comes from, and how it's so tastefully utilized throughout the entire Star Wars saga. And that reference is made in one of the first fucking frames of this video. And hell, after Paul Duncan's book came out and Lucas's quote made their decades of expertise on his movies look like a complete joke, they of course had to cope with it the only way they knew how in their own shitty articles, in order to desperately try and save a little bit of face, putting a negative spin on his words like they always do and trying to make Lucas seem like he's the insecure one. When all Lucas did was answer truthfully in an interview that some author was making for his Star Wars Archives book. But this collective of media and certain fans, in some weird way, saw it as an attack on them, and their incredible lack of both intelligence and taste, instead of just accepting the fact that they made a bunch of really dumb assertions about his movies and just correcting themselves and moving on. But as we all know, that's not how the media and the older guard of Star Wars fans and their pathetic followers conduct themselves. They will instead deflect and ignore and continue to live in their own delusional reality, no matter how much evidence to the contrary to their pathetic narrative that there is and continues to be brought to light, and they will instead just dig their heels in that much more. It's sad, really, it truly is. But back to the now infamous rough cut from the Phantom Menace that's constantly misinterpreted. People seem to be under the impression that Lucas and his team of quote-unquote yes men are panicking about the movie apparently being awful and unfixable. But if you listen carefully, all they're really discussing is how incorrectly cut together the ending is, and how it needs to be reworked and refined, which is no doubt what you'd expect from a rough cut screening.
I know, right?
However, what many either do not know or do not mention is the fact that much like the original trilogy, this rough cut screening for the Phantom Menace that people constantly reference for the most disingenuous reasons wasn't the only rough cut screening for the Phantom Menace. Far from it, in fact. And much like the rough cut screenings on the original trilogy films, some took place with members of the production crew, the editors, etc., etc., and some were showcased to George Lucas's inner circle of friends, most if not all of which were well-established filmmakers, so they could provide some insight and constructive feedback for George Lucas to apply to his Star Wars films. One such example that visual effects supervisor John Knoll describes on the audio commentary of The Phantom Menace is when George Lucas showed, again, one of likely many of the rough cut screenings to his friends and colleagues in the film industry, and when it came down to the pod race sequence and the moment where Anakin was struggling to repair his racer, to some in the screening it came across as too short and lacking in tension. So it was actually Ron Howard, who again was just one of the people in attendance at this rough cut screening, who suggested to George that he should drag out that moment for just a little bit more to maximize the tension. So George Lucas had his animation team, led by John Knoll, add in some extra shots to extend that sequence by just a couple of seconds as per Ron Howard's suggestion.
Well, this whole moment where Anakin's engine catches fire and he falls behind was greatly extended after George showed it to some friends of his. He showed the scene in rough cut to Ron Howard and a bunch of his other friends. And Ron suggested that this moment where Anakin is struggling to try and get his engine reignited should be extended so that you really feel the tension of him falling behind and hurry up. So we got about 10 shots ahead after that screening.
So yeah, those disastrous rough cut screenings for the original trilogy movies, well, they also happened for the prequel films as well, and like with the originals, they also went through the same test screening and feedback process with most of the same people, including the likes of Ron Howard, Steven Spielberg, etc., etc. So I guess those established filmmakers had no such problem with the romance dialogue and the oh-so-dreaded sand line, because they weren't a bunch of brain-dead simpletons.
Really makes you think.
And whatever feedback was given on the dialogue was applied before the final cut of each prequel trilogy film. Not only that, but again, one of several people who apparently did dialogue polishes on the prequels, most notably The Phantom Menace in fact, was the incredibly outspoken Carrie Fisher, who knew better than anybody just how difficult Star Wars dialogue could be to work with. George Lucas hired her to do dialogue polishes to help punch up the script, just as he had the Hux and Kasdan do so on the original trilogy. The most criticized Star Wars film when it comes to dialogue, even though George Lucas, by his own admission, had been moronically beaten with that stick for entire decades prior to it even existing, is undoubtedly Attack of the Clones. And when I say most criticized film when it comes to dialogue, I mean it's the film where the same three quotes are cited over and over again, divorced from their context, and are constantly lambasted and showcased by moronic Star Wars fans, and more specifically these Gen X weirdos and the media, as if they're this supposed holy grail of poor dialogue writing, because apparently George Lucas doesn't understand how a petulant, awkward teenager warrior monk who grew up in slavery on a desert planet would respond to an equally awkward woman who recounts how pleasant her upbringing was on a paradise planet of rich, greenery, crystal clear water, and lovely warm beaches, ideal for sunbaking.
I love the water. We used to lie out on the sand and let the sun dry us, and try to guess the names of the birds singing.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Yeah, those awful lines written by George Lucas that apparently nobody could save the film from.
Right.
Setting aside the fact that there is absolutely nothing wrong with those lines, and I'll come back to why that is in just a few moments, but going back to those who were so quick to point the finger at Lucas as being this control freak when it came to every aspect of the prequels, including the script for Attack of the Clones, the part that these individuals always neglect to bring up is that George Lucas, in fact, had a co-screenplay writer for Attack of the Clones.
It's not true. That's impossible.
That co-screenplay writer for episode 2 was a guy called Jonathan Hales, one of the writers that helped George Lucas by collaborating with him on the Young Indiana Jones television show, along with Carrie Fisher, might I add. And Hales, being the co-screenplay writer for episode 2, is scarcely ever mentioned because, again, the narrative goes that George Lucas only collaborated with people who challenged his ideas back on the original trilogy. But Attack of the Clones, having a heavily involved co-writer for its screenplay, not to mention uncredited script doctors, throws a giant fucking titanium spanner that jams the gears of that narrative right the fuck up, as Rick McCallum, who was producer on the prequels, makes crystal clear in the audio commentary of Attack of the Clones.
I think George has been able, with Jonathan, to really meld a very strong, wonderful story, compassionate love story that also at the same time begins to hint at the danger that lies within all of us. You know, what is it that makes us do these horrible things to each other? What is it that makes us do bad things overall? You know, is it our environment? Is it genetics? Is it the way we're encoded? Is it the way we're wired? Or is it the fact that something happens to us that we never really recover from? And that is fascinating drama, especially when you know what the outcome is, and especially with somebody as good as Hayden is. I mean, he's a wonderful boy. He's a wonderful actor. He's a fantastic person. And there is something damaged there, not in Hayden, but the character that he plays.
You're exactly the way I remember you in my dreams.
Jonathan's been involved for a long time, actually. I mean, he's always been my secret weapon. He was always very interested, obviously, in writing Star Wars. And it was something that George and I had talked about a long time ago. And often when George would get into periods which were difficult for him to, you know, find the space to write, I would say, listen, you know, Jonathan's waiting. You know, anytime, I just have to give him a call. Just let me know. And it got to the point where we were building models of sets and sending them to George. He was having to try and force the script around those sets because there's no way we were going to actually be ready. And, you know, it was a very interesting process because it started to work. And, you know, about May, Jonathan came in, they sat down, they never left each other for a month, and they came up with this incredible thing.
Now, admittedly, there is very limited citations for just what exactly Jonathan Hales' contributions to Attack of the Clones was, specifically outside of his general job description. And what Rick McCallum has outlined in the episode 2 commentary, saying that Hales was heavily involved in crafting the love story. There are scarcely any interviews with Jonathan Hales himself, as far as I've researched, which, to be clear, is subject to change. However, there is one very interesting interview I did manage to track down, which is from an old Star Wars Insider magazine issue, which has an entire article dedicated to Jonathan Hales' involvement in helping write the script for Attack of the Clones. And interestingly enough, this article came out while principal photography on episode 2 was still going on. Now, fair warning, it is quite a lengthy interview, despite it being quite vague in some areas, since Hales didn't want to give away too much of the plot and story, since the movie was still being made. But the interview does cover a wide variety of things, including Young Indiana Jones, which Hales worked very closely with Lucas on, and is how they grew their rapport with one another. Though outside of that, there's very little that's actually applicable to the topic at hand, regarding the work that Jonathan Hales did on the young indie television series, so I'll be glossing over those sections, keeping it as focused on Star Wars as possible. The frames you are currently seeing on screen is the whole interview in its entirety, so if you want to pause the video and read it through, you're more than welcome to. But anyway, here's what Jonathan Hales had to say regarding his collaboration with George Lucas on Star Wars Episode 2. After the interview's brief introduction, it goes on to quote Hales saying, "You know before you start how the story's going to end. Everybody knows, and that's both part of the problem and part of the satisfaction of solving the problem." Quote, "But the wonderful thing about Episode 2 is that the central character is Anakin Skywalker, and the whole thing is really about what happens to him and how eventually he becomes Darth Vader. It's not the story of a villain, it's about someone who is incredibly gifted, but is trapped and almost doomed by his good qualities." Hales had to do similarly retrospective thinking for Young Indy, for which he ultimately wrote or co-wrote 7 episodes guiding Indiana Jones from the 8-year-old played by Corey Carrier into the adult Indy played by Harrison Ford in 3 feature films, and briefly 1 episode of the television series. Skipping ahead to the next part of the interview where Hales details his role in co-writing Episode 2 with George Lucas, he discusses how he came to be in that position in the first place, and how that came to fruition after he'd finished working on the Young Indiana Jones series with George Lucas. Quote, "I don't remember quite how it came to be, but somehow it was established that I would be working on Episode 2, he said. Quote, "I can't remember whether George said on a particular day, 'I want you to be in it,' or if I said, 'Okay, George, which one am I doing?' It was talked about before they made Episode 1. Every so often I would say, quote, 'Rick, don't forget, will you?'" So it's important to note that little detail because it shows that hiring Jonathan Hales to write Episode 2 wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision by George Lucas. He actually had that role planned out for him well in advance. Anyway, let's continue. The interview goes on. While he was waiting, Hales had a unique vantage point to watch the development of the prequel trilogy. Quote, "I was rather privileged in the sense that I was almost the first person outside the staff to read the script for the Phantom Menace. Which was great," he recalled. Quote, "I got to see a fair amount of it being filmed too, so I felt a bit like part of the making of it." End quote. Yet Hales said that despite his closeness to Episode 1, he was not a part of making it, and he had no input for Lucas on his script. It then goes on to quote Jonathan Hales saying, "My input was, 'I think this is really great, George,' he said. Quote, 'I truly did. We talked a little bit about the ending, which he hadn't written at that point, but I loved it.' Once again, another important detail that Jonathan Hales was many of the uncredited collaborators and or points of feedback for George Lucas when he was writing The Phantom Menace. Even if he didn't provide much input for what George could have done differently, because he didn't want to, because he thought the script was great, and rightfully fucking so, just for the record, even though he didn't receive much input on how he could have changed his script, George Lucas went and sought feedback from whoever he could, from many of his longtime collaborators, including but certainly not limited to Jonathan Hales. Not to mention, much like the original trilogy actors who had been very disingenuously quoted from several infamously misleading interviews which we've already discussed, Jonathan Hales was referring to a very primitive screenplay draft of The Phantom Menace, since he himself is quoted saying that one of the very few things he discussed with Lucas was the film's ending, which Lucas at the time hadn't written and therefore hadn't completed the script yet. However, unlike those same actors and original trilogy alumni who have been credited by Lucas's detractors as being the outspoken difference makers against George Lucas's supposed terrible dialogue and screenplay writing, when in actuality they, according to their own accounts and the timeline of events, were simply recounting the confusion they had upon their first glance at a Star Wars script, meaning they had absolutely no idea what Star Wars was, not to mention the fact that they were commenting on one of George Lucas's earlier drafts and not the final shooting script. This, however, was not the case with Jonathan Hales, because Star Wars by the late 90s was far more tangible as a concept, as a story, and as a franchise. And by this point, Jonathan Hales had been working with George Lucas for years and knew exactly how his writing process worked. So it's very likely he simply held back on his input, knowing that those grievances were likely going to be fixed anyway in the final script, which Lucas had put through numerous additional drafts that would later be punched up by Carrie Fisher and others as well. The interview goes on. That's not too surprising, considering Hales has been a Star Wars fan since he took his 2 young sons to see the original in 1977. Quote, "My youngest son had actually already seen it, but he insisted we go, so the 3 of us went, and we went off to see them every time they came out after that. Somehow the trick had been achieved, taking sci-fi adventure and putting it into a context in which you can have this terrific story and absolutely stunning visuals. I just sat there and said, wow, why hasn't anyone done this before?" Hales said that his first impression of Star Wars remains so strong that A New Hope remains his favorite chapter in the saga. Quote, "There are bits in the other 2 that I like tremendously well, but as an entity, A New Hope is my favorite of the first 3. But then I know people who disagree and tend to think that Empire, or for that matter Jedi, is the best, and I'm happy to argue in a friendly way." End quote. He had another chance to think about it once George Lucas gave him the call for episode 2. Quote, "I did watch the previous movies," he said, "but not in a sort of sit down and do my homework kind of way. I looked at them over a period of a couple of weeks just to remind myself of some things, but I didn't sit down and do a crash course in Star Wars." End quote. From the start, though, it was clear that writing for Star Wars would be different than writing for Indiana Jones. The immediate change was that Star Wars was just George and me, whereas young Indiana Jones was George and 6 or 7 of us. Quote, "Also, the story is much bigger in terms of scope and duration. You weren't talking about a 50-minute episode of a television series anymore. This is a major story about a universe and a galaxy far, far away, and the sheer scope is absolutely terrific." End quote. Lucas and Hales approached their daunting task by diving into work on crafting a specific outline of the story that Lucas had already figured out in a broader sense. Quote, "I sat down with George and together we evolved an outline, a structure," Hales says. "Then we went away for a while, and after a bit we met again and spent a few days going over it and transforming it. And then I sat down and worked my backside off. He was doing his writing and I was doing my writing, and then we'd go back and I'd take his input and rewrite. The process was long, but Hales said working one-on-one with Lucas was a unique pleasure. Quote, "George continually surprised me," he said, "the way his ideas would come and the kinds of ideas they were, and how they would appear, and how he would handle thoughts of mine. It was a series of surprises. That's what's so good about it." End quote. The writer said that he was especially impressed with the intricate plot Lucas had set up. Quote, "It's so clever. I can't tell you how clever it is, the way it all worked out. The love story, the insight into Anakin Skywalker, the incredible evil of Palpatine. I'm impressed by that." End quote. As the case with anyone involved in a new Star Wars movie, Hales was tight-lipped when it came to specifics about the plot. But he did say, quote, "I think the central thread of it is the love story. Of course, there are huge action sequences, as well as a wonderful whole thread involving Obi-Wan, but balancing that, allied with that, is this developing love story between these 2 young people, and that in itself is complex. I love the way it alters and changes. It's not simply love at first sight and away we go. The ups and downs it goes through are terrific. It's a love story that has to be treated in some depth. And from that point of view, I think episode 2, compared with the other movies so far, gets into the human level, which is more complex than any of the other pictures. That is both a challenge and the risk of it." End quote. Hales said that he also enjoyed working on the development of the relationship between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Quote, "It's kind of fun," he said. "Although they're very serious, of course, it's master and apprentice, but they do have a spirited and humorous relationship with each other, which is a pleasure to write." On the other hand, Hales admitted, Quote, I think Yoda's quite tricky to write for. I love Yoda, my wife adores Yoda, but he's a little tricky to write for. George is great at Yoda. He's also really good at 3PO and R2. He's graduated in those characters. End quote. But the bigger challenge, Hales said, was writing a movie that is both prequel and sequel, spanning the gap between the sunny celebration that ended Episode 1 and the grim conflicts expected in Episode 3, and believably moving Anakin Skywalker from the lovable kid Jake Lloyd played to the Sith Lord bursting onto the blockade runner in A New Hope. Quote, I think Episode 3 is absolutely crucial in that regard. A lot of things happen in Episode 3, and they happen to the other characters as well, but for me, that's really the central idea, that Anakin is the chosen one, yet because of what happens to him, maybe in impatience or whatever, and his very good qualities, he is slowly turned to the dark side. You know, that's the story of Lucifer, the bright angel and all. I love it. And of course, it's all masterminded by Palpatine, so he's up against that. Episode 2's status as the middle film of a trilogy raises some comparisons with The Empire Strikes Back. The bleak turn the story is set to take creates a tougher quandary, because unlike Empire, which was leading into the triumphant Return of the Jedi, Episode 2 will be followed by what George Lucas has said will be the darkest film in the series. Quote, you don't end up with a triumphant parade as the first ones tend to do, Hales said. Quote, it ends very much on the first steps of a bridge that is going to take you into the third film, like Empire does. But we are heading in a dark direction, whereas in Empire we were heading towards the light. The ending of Episode 2 is a mixture of both triumph and tragedy. It's both happy and sad at the same time. So you end on a note which is partly joyous and partly foreboding. End quote. With Hales' job on Episode 2 setting up the next movie, he is already being asked whether Lucas has asked him to work on Episode 3. Quote, no, we haven't talked about that, Hales said. I mean, we've talked about the third one, but not in those terms. I just talked about it with George as the extension of this story, so that what is going to happen and why can be consistent. End quote. Besides, it's too soon to start thinking too much about Episode 3, especially since Lucas always refines his films as he goes along. And Hales' work on Episode 2 is not completely over. Quote, I am expecting to do some more work on it, he said. Quote, I'm going to Sydney and I'll have another session with George to see if there are some more thoughts. I've got one or two thoughts myself that I want to put to him, or things we can do, and yes, there may well be one or two things still to be done when principal photography is completed, but that's planned for anyway. End quote.
It's not true. That's impossible.
So what are the key takeaways from this interview? Well, Jonathan Hales and George Lucas were friends and collaborators long before the prequels were ever made. Also, Hales was present on the set for much of the filming of Episode 1, and was even one of the first of several people Lucas sought out to give him feedback on the script for The Phantom Menace. And this most likely took place before Carrie Fisher and others as well did their dialogue polish, since the version of the script that Hales claims he saw, Lucas had not written the ending for as of yet, meaning it was an earlier draft of the script. We also know that the decision to have Hales co-write Episode 2 was made long before The Phantom Menace was released. Also, Hales and Lucas wrote the script for Attack of the Clones together from the very beginning and were constantly checking and refining each other's work, as opposed to The Empire Strikes Back, for instance, where Lucas went ahead on his own and wrote the second draft, and what would become the bulk of the story and script for The Empire Strikes Back, and he did so in 6 weeks, before merely refining and polishing it in later script conferences with Kirshner and Kasdan. Jonathan Hales worked basically on every aspect of the script with George Lucas, from the love story to the overarching plotline and the camaraderie between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Lucas took plenty of ideas on board from Hales, who immensely enjoyed the process, and Hales basically gives George Lucas all the credit for the finalized dialogue of Star Wars alumni characters R2, 3PO, and Yoda for the screenplay of Attack of the Clones, which, given Lucas's work on the original Star Wars trilogy, should surprise absolutely no one.
Now, where are you taking me? This is such a drag. I'm quite beside myself.
Much to learn, you still have.
It's also worth noting that Attack of the Clones has been criticized on the grounds of supposedly having a rushed, sloppy script writing process because the shooting script was finalized just a few days before principal photography began. And certain Star Wars know-nothings out there like to claim the reason being is that Lucas was too focused on his new toy box of digital effects than writing a good story and realistic characters, which is why the script supposedly suffered. And of course, these people always leave out the fact that George Lucas had a co-writer who was helping him both write and refine every word of the script, because it absolutely demolishes this ridiculous George Lucas can't write dialogue narrative that they've constructed. Again, making sure to cite the same 3 cheesy romance lines as their quote-unquote evidence, and then to maintain this narrative, they will all but completely remove George Lucas from the writer's room when they like to tell their little fairy tale version of events when it came to making the childhood trilogy that Kasdan, Kirshner, and Marshall Lucas saved from George, which is why they were supposedly utterly without flaw. Which again, regarding the creation of the original trilogy, and as we've discussed, couldn't be further from the truth. However, in regards to finishing the shooting script on a crunch before the commencement of principal photography, well, this is actually more common than you might think. In fact, it was absolutely the case on the original Star Wars film. However, again, Jonathan Hales gave this interview while Episode 2 was in the middle of principal photography, and he clearly states that there was still more work to be done on the script, meaning the shooting script was not the be-all and end-all for what would be in the final cut of the film. And the shooting script for Attack of the Clones would later be altered and refined, which, you guessed it, was also the case on Star Wars A New Hope, where the entire third act was fucking changed. And in the case of Episode 2, at the time anyway, this would may or may not lead to reshoots, but as Jonathan Hales said in this very interview, in the case of Attack of the Clones, as far as the script goes, that was quote-unquote all planned for anyway. Which also means that the writing process for Attack of the Clones' script wasn't a sloppy rush job as certain disgruntled Lucas detractors with a chip on their shoulder love to claim. But then again, as evident from the many examples we've discussed already, those individuals only pretend to know everything, when in actuality, they know jack shit. However, the biggest takeaway from this interview with Jonathan Hales is that this ridiculous, what shall we call it, Star Wars math that certain fans, or rather fanatics, have concocted to justify their stance on the prequel trilogy of George Lucas's Star Wars saga as quote-unquote proof that he is a quote-unquote bad dialogue writer, is actually some of the most hilariously backwards logic you're likely to ever see once you actually have the facts. So it's no wonder it was born out of the arse crack of internet grubs, and it's most often propagated and likely originated from hardcore fans of The Empire Strikes Back, who like to paint Lucas as the villain for almost everything that came afterwards, as yet another blemish on the franchise that could never quite measure up.
Take a big step back and literally fuck your own face!
Including the Star Wars movie where half the fucking plot was centered around teddy bears. Horror. That many of these same people love to forget due to revisionist history, that before it was the original trilogy versus the prequel trilogy, it was the first 2 Star Wars movies versus the teddy bear film. And prior to the teddy bear film, what these people love to forget the most is originally it was Star Wars, George Lucas's magnum opus, and then the second one with the puppet. Point I'm getting at is regarding the prequels, it was a fanatical group of the old guard who started this narrative of Lucas supposedly firing or distancing himself from the quote-unquote good collaborators who made his movies for him, be it his wife, who he had to babysit in the editing room, his director, who Lucas had to babysit on set after that same director nearly bankrupted him due to taking his sweet-ass time with the money that wasn't his, and of course the co-writer of A New Hope 2.0 and the guy who wrote Solo. Oh, whoops, that's the same guy. Yes, without these key players, George Lucas was given a no-holds-barred free pass to fuck up the franchise that they loved, by having the role of director and writer all to himself. Before I continue, I gotta address the elephant in the room here. I know I haven't been as kind to The Empire Strikes Back as many people would have liked, and while it's certainly not my favorite of George Lucas's 6-part Star Wars saga, and I do have a number of issues with it, but my big contention is not actually with Empire Strikes Back, the movie. It's with the cesspool of the insufferably hardcore Empire Strikes Back fandom, who put the movie on this bizarre pedestal for what they pretend aren't the most shallow and insecure reasons one can have, including but not limited to, again, clinging to an undeniably excellent twist that totally doesn't carry the movie for them, despite their insistence on people needing to not watch these movies in the chronological order for fear of having it spoiled for others who otherwise would likely not share their perspective on it being the greatest Star Wars movie ever made. Another of the most shallow and moronic reasons they choose to put Empire Strikes Back on this untouchable pedestal is because it's supposedly the darkest and most mature Star Wars film in the franchise. Which, I mean...
I don't know how we're gonna get out of this one.
Don't blame me. I'm an interpreter. I'm not supposed to know a power socket from a computer terminal. R2!
And not to mention, these were the same crybabies who whined that the Phantom Menace supposedly had a mundane plot because it was apparently overloaded with Senate scenes, which they had absolutely no interest in because there was no lasers or explosions happening on screen. How very adult of them. I mean, hell, they threw a giant hissy fit that the movie was entirely about trade disputes because it had one line referring to it in the opening crawl, when in actuality, the taxation of trade disputes was merely the inciting event, and 90 to 95% of the movie has absolutely nothing to do with that at all. And finally, how can Empire Strikes Back be even remotely considered to be the most mature film in the franchise when Revenge of the Sith had decapitations, betrayal, immolation, the rise of tyranny, a religious genocide, childbirth, and graphic surgery, for God's sake? But yeah, this pathetic collective of Empire Strikes Back fanatics still hold the movie as their sacred cow for this incredibly dumb and shallow reason, but sadly, it's not the worst. And the other reason being a gigantic middle finger against George Lucas for supposedly being the most removed from this movie out of any Star Wars movie as the main reason for why it was the bestest Star Wars ever created. Which again, if you're familiar with Rinzler's books or just have a baseline in common sense, that is blatantly not true, and George Lucas simply had the grace to remove himself from the director and screenplay credits, as we discussed earlier. But one of the most stomach-churning phrases that hardcore Empire Strikes Back fanatics love to propagate, and the cornerstone of their rationale, which sadly much of the online media and influencers who are a part of this collective or have simply bought into it also propagate and parrot off each other en masse, is, quote, Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars movie because it was the one that George Lucas was the least involved in.
The greatest film of the original trilogy, one of the best sequels ever made, and the movie Star Wars fans love the most, just so happens to be the one where George Lucas was involved the least. The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh my god, my insides are on fire!
I'll come back to this in just a second, but I'd be remiss if I didn't go on this next little tangent because the biggest counterpoint to that buttfuck of a phrase came in the form of swift karma. Once Star Wars was sold to the House of Mouse, and I try to avoid talking about Disney as much as possible, since this same moronic band of Star Wars freaks like to pass it off as their most dismissive coping mechanism for why the prequels are quote-unquote suddenly liked, as if they didn't always have a large fan base and weren't beloved when they first released, like every single Star Wars film that came out before it, despite a minority of detractors.
Do you think this is going to be as big as Star Wars?
Bigger!
Yeah.
Bigger!
And yet a lot of the critics are panning it.
Well, what do they know?
But again, that's just more projection on their part. But always remember that this collective of irrational clowns that love to cling to this narrative that they've constructed surrounding Empire Strikes Back were also the ones who insisted this is why the Disney movies would be a success with the fans, because George Lucas was finally gone.
We will fix what you started.
I don't like sand. It's coarse, rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Which is why they immediately started saying Star Wars was quote-unquote saved with a shameless rerun of their childhood, which again was their main contention with the prequels, despite the fact that they will never outright admit it. But the writing is on the fucking wall with that one, because they accepted it with open arms. And you don't have to look far to find plenty of examples of that being the case. Most hypocritically by those who fucking made their living online trying to tear down the prequel trilogy. And hell, in the beginning they were actually defending the Disney movies.
Forget the love letter to the originals that was The Force Awakens, because Episode 8 subverts everything you've come to expect, making Last Jedi a refreshing update to a predictable formula. But forget about the butthurt fanboys who are just mad the movie isn't closer to the one they wrote in their heads.
Let's watch my favorite part again, shall we?
But forget about the butthurt fanboys who are just mad the movie isn't closer to the one they wrote in their heads.
Really makes you think.
Even from those who were way ahead of the curve,
You will beg for George Lucas before the end?
To call it out for the garbage it was. But then shortly after the shine wore off and it became apparent how disastrous the new trilogy actually was, they quickly changed their tune. And even now try to pretend that they always hated the new trilogy, or they'll maintain that A New Hope 2.0 was actually good, and that we were simply denied greatness or something with the later movies.
You stupid.
To those people, I have a phrase of my own that I'd like you to memorize. Go fuck yourselves. And to the rest of you out there, I say this. Do not forgive, do not forget, and don't let them forget either. But back to this stupid little phrase. As far as the original 6 Star Wars movies go, if we go by this idiotic logic of Star Wars math, these people who measure the quality of a Star Wars film based on how removed George Lucas is from the production, you mean to tell me that the film that's considered by these same dweebs as the quote-unquote best one, that being The Empire Strikes Back, where George Lucas had to act as a fucking babysitter on set and wrote the bulk of what would become the final script of Empire Strikes Back by himself out of necessity in 6 weeks before it was put through subsequent drafts which merely polished what he had already written, which were based on changes that he himself wanted for the script, since it went through the same annotative editing as Lee Brackett's first draft did, before Lucas deemed it acceptable for a shooting script, which would also be subject to change. Yet for his most widely contested film when it comes to this Star Wars dialogue, that being Attack of the Clones, despite Lucas again having been beaten with that stick years prior to it ever being written, and mostly pertained to the original trilogy up to that point anyway, while George Lucas, just as he did with Empire Strikes Back, wrote the story for Attack of the Clones, but unlike The Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas opted to write the entire script from the very start with a completely separate writer, before passing it off to uncredited script doctors for dialogue polishing, whereas with Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas wrote the story and the entire second draft of the script on his own, and then basically passed it off to Kasdan for a dialogue polish. In other words, George Lucas had far more direct influence over the script on Empire Strikes Back than he did on Attack of the Clones.
Ironic.
And just for the record, I don't even necessarily agree that Attack of the Clones had the weakest script from George Lucas's Star Wars saga. But just going by this same idiotic logic of Star Wars movies being better without George Lucas, if we go by this same Star Wars math metric for what lent to the quality of the writing for each of the Star Wars films, and less George Lucas hands-on involvement, supposedly equaling better writing and dialogue, the script for Empire Strikes Back had more direct involvement from George Lucas and less collaboration than the script for Attack of the Clones, which had less direct involvement from Lucas and more collaboration with the likes of Jonathan Hales and others as well. So for those of you out there continuously spouting that idiotic phrase without even the faintest fucking idea of what you're referring to, congratulations, you played yourselves. And if we take it one step further, as mentioned earlier, George Lucas had plenty of people, including but not limited to Carrie Fisher, helping him iron out the kinks on his script for The Phantom Menace. He had Jonathan Hales as a co-writer along with several other script doctors on Attack of the Clones. On the original Star Wars film, he had the Hux who helped him polish the script. And then, of course, he had Kasdan help him polish the scripts on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. But it's almost a unanimous consensus that Revenge of the Sith is the best of the prequel scripts, and by a large proportion of Star Wars fans, it's also praised as the best Star Wars script in the entire saga. And as far as my research has taken me at least, which again is subject to change, unless they were simply uncredited, none of those individuals that I've mentioned up till now collaborated with Lucas on that script. And it's easily some of, if not his best work. It's also worth noting that a script is heavily elevated by the quality of its story. As we know, George Lucas wrote all of the stories for the Star Wars saga, as well as most of what would become the final screenplays for those films by himself. But Revenge of the Sith and Empire Strikes Back especially are often praised as having the two best stories in the entire saga. Revenge of the Sith was written and made by Lucas, divorced from any of his writer-director collaborators on Empire Strikes Back. So whatever work his collaborators ended up doing on The Empire Strikes Back, most of which again was supervised by Lucas himself, either directly or indirectly, for all of the praise certain Star Wars freaks love to reallocate towards Lucas's collaborators, comparatively speaking here, in terms of their responsibilities and contributions, they stood on the shoulders of a giant.
Ironic.
And that is evident by what little they were able to accomplish without him. And let's not forget what will always be the most important piece of evidence against this ridiculous Star Wars math nonsense of lesser Lucas equals greater Star Wars. While The Help would stand on Lucas's shoulders for each of the latter original trilogy films, easily the biggest hurdle in the path of getting Star Wars made is the all-time classic original film, which came out in 1977, which, with the exception of Marsha Lucas, who got tired of being babysat by her husband and actually left the production of Star Wars long before it was even finished, none of The Help was actually present for the production of that movie. Lucas was both the writer and director, a double duty responsibility that dwarfed Kirshner's responsibilities on Empire Strikes Back, as well as Richard Marquand's on Return of the Jedi for that matter. There was no story, no script, no concept art, no cast, no film score. There was absolutely nothing tangible to go off when it came to beginning production on the original film. Lucas started with nothing. It took him 3 years to get the story down and the script written, and with far less resources and time than any other Star Wars production, got that film made, and it's still considered by many as the best film in the saga. So to pretend that less George Lucas equals greater Star Wars, and that George Lucas isn't the only true common denominator for its writing quality and long-term success, is asinine. Right, now after all that, let's hear what the man himself, two-time Academy Award nominated dialogue writer, who wrote 6, arguably 7 of the most influential scripts of all time, as well as one of the most highly regarded stories in the history of human literature. And that's not even accounting for Indiana Jones, despite never liking or enjoying the process of writing.
When I started film school, I was a dyed-in-the-wool cinematic purist. I said, and I went to school, and I had to go into screenwriting. So I was really not a real fan of writing, which is ironic that mostly what I do now is write.
Major fucking flex! Let's see what the creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, has to say about the much maligned and criticized, by some, quote-unquote awkward and cringeworthy romantic dialogue in Attack of the Clones, which, again, was a script that Lucas hired a co-writer for to assist with the entirety of the writing process. And thus the script itself that these degenerates condemned for having too much Lucas in it actually had more collaboration with the development of its script than the one that these same detractors somehow seem to find less awkward, that possesses literal incest in the film that they flogged themselves off to as being the quote-unquote bestest Star Wars film ever made for all of the stupidest reasons imaginable, including that same moronic lack of Lucas Star Wars math that makes literal no sense, as we've discussed ad nauseum at this point. But hey, according to them, George Lucas doesn't have a clue about how to write dialogue or how to write characters, and that's why the romantic dialogue in Attack of the Clones is awkward, and because, well, awkward dialogue is automatically bad dialogue, right?
She's beginning to see him as an attractive young man, but they've already decided in that very first awkward scene that they weren't going to go there with that first kiss. But obviously that kiss has opened up a whole set of underlying feelings that they can't get rid of that will be dealt with later on here.
Oh, gee golly wow, it turns out George Lucas actually did know what he was doing all along, as he so eloquently laid out in the commentary. Quote, that first awkward scene with that first kiss, end quote, turns out the quote-unquote awkwardness with the dialogue and acting that's so widely criticized by this collective of intellectual tooth decay as a supposed flaw with this film due to Lucas's supposed lack of talent was actually done by design. Intentional, part of the story, hence not a mistake, meaning not an actual flaw.
I know, right?
So what about the fireplace scene? You know, where Anakin is supposedly being overly melodramatic and mouthing cringy romance lines in a supposed attempt to woo Padme? Surely there was no other reason or purpose for that other than George Lucas's ineptitude for dialogue writing. I mean, these are the true experts over here who know better than him, right?
The scene, this little eating scene is designed to, again, just get them casually back into a situation where we can set up the next scene in the fireplace. Him using the Force to cut fruit and stuff. He's, again, refers back to his little tension with Obi-Wan and that he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. You also see in her that she's attracted to him just by the way she looks at him. But then we get to the real scene. This is one of the pivotal scenes in their relationship where he reveals the pain and suffering that he's been going through this whole time, ever since the first time he laid eyes on her again. But obviously, even before that, as he's dreamed about her over the years. He lets himself go here. It's intended to be overly dramatic, sort of almost even overly operatic in its emotional intensity on his part. He's young, and he's kind of spilling his guts out to her. She doesn't quite know how to deal with this, and it's putting her kind of on the spot, but she ultimately will refuse here to go along with him, which again is a pivotal moment for the rest of the film. In relation to their emotional maturity, he is much more impetuous and much more immature. She is obviously older and you know, in a professional thing, but a queen and a senator and a leader, so that she's much more reality based on all of this, and can look forward and say what the consequences are of their actions. She's just not going to let her emotions run rampant.
Wow! What do you know?
So it was, quote, intended to be overly dramatic, end quote, because Anakin is young and immature and is venting his pent-up angst and frustrations with being so close to Padme, who he has feelings for, but can't actually act on those feelings despite the many, many signals of reciprocation she has given him, hinting that she also has feelings for him too. So in other words, Anakin wasn't mouthing supposed quote-unquote cringy romance lines to try and get into Padme's panties. He was just angsting out and bearing his soul to her, really. Not all that unlike how young and confused teenagers tend to be when it comes to romance, really. It just so happens that this romance story takes place in Star Wars. And hence, as we've beaten to death at this point, it wasn't written how, quote, normal people talk, but it still maintained that tangible familiarity so that the dialogue would plausibly sound like it came from a petulant teenager. it's almost like George Lucas wrote the dialogue in line with the style of Star Wars, which he established from the very beginning, and tailored that stylized dialogue for the characters, or something. But, come on, who are we kidding, right? I mean, writers aren't supposed to do that. Romantic dialogue always has to sound generic, pleasant, smooth, and cool for the audience. And it always has to be delivered with swagger, damn it, like Han Solo in The Empire Strikes Back. Or like every single James Bond film ever made. In order to be considered quote-unquote good dialogue, or more specifically, quote, good romantic dialogue, who cares if it sounds absolutely nothing like the characters that are delivering it? Or who cares if it doesn't even sound like it comes from the same universe the characters exist in? Or hell, who cares if the dialogue doesn't at all fit the circumstances the characters find themselves in? Or the style that the writer has been maintaining consistency with for almost 3 decades prior to that point in time. No, the audience can never feel uncomfortable or quote-unquote awkward. That's a supposed no-no when it comes to cinema. More on that shortly. And they must always be brain blasted with punchy one-liners all of the time, damn it. Well, again, at least according to this same collective of know-nothing degenerate dumbfucks, who simply threw a pissy fit that their precious Darth Vader could have ever been an awkward teenager that replied to his love interest who was talking about sand with a perfectly in-character line about why he doesn't like sand.
We used to lie out on the sand and let the sun dry us, and try to guess the names of the birds singing.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
I know, instead, let's watch them make complete embarrassments out of themselves, as well as making a butt-fuckload of shitty video essays and reviews just parodying one another filled with actual unintentional cringe, as well as a whole documentary with completely shallow and vacuous dipshits talking about why George Lucas should supposedly be removed from Star Wars at all costs.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Good job. Even he realizes that if they did have a relationship, it would lead to doom. There's no way it could work. When she reminds him of where this would lead and what the consequences would be, he does accept it.
Really makes you think.
Now, if you've had your head buried up the anal cavity of the internet's parroted and recycled drivel machine of misinformation and bullshit, then all this might come as a bit of a shock to you. That all of these supposed clunky dialogue and acting, as some like to call it, wasn't an error as a result of incompetence. It was carefully crafted by design for the characters and intentional for the story. And above all else, consistent in its design to adhere to the style George had set up for Star Wars since all the way back in 1977 with A New Hope. Again, to reiterate, the only real change made to what he was doing was that he was telling a different story with different characters, and more specifically in this instance, a different romance. And it got precisely the reaction that Lucas intended it to. However, it was just perceived as a mistake by some incredibly shallow and parasitic Star Wars fanatics, because the desired effect for this character dynamic wasn't, man, isn't Han Solo such a player? Look how smooth and cool he is around Leia. What a badass. Or, look, laser swords and space battles.
I ain't got a good brain.
And so a handful of bad faith audience members, content creators, and the media took what was the desired effect and constructed an extremely flimsy narrative about why it was supposedly all wrong and a fundamental failure of filmmaking, and why it didn't belong in their precious space fantasy saga that was so integral to their childhood, along with all this other pseudo-intellectual horse shit. And then they proceeded to gaslight their family, their friends, and their audience members into believing it. And they in turn would propagate this all over the internet, and the cycle would repeat itself over and over. However, the majority of Star Wars fans, which I guess became the silent majority online in the late 2000s and early 2010s, these normal individuals had no trouble understanding the desired effect and why George Lucas had written and directed the characters and the story this way. For them, it wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't even a surprise. It was just watching the damn movie.
Wow! What do you know?
Hell, if you'll indulge me for just a few moments, I'll provide a little insight into my own personal experience growing up with the Star Wars prequels, and I wasn't even 10 years old at the time, meaning I was actually below the target demographic age bracket when Attack of the Clones was released. And although at the time I couldn't articulate my perspective the way I am able to now, and some of the romance dynamic kind of went over my head back in 2002 because I wasn't old enough to really comprehend how adult romances worked, I knew enough to understand that Anakin was a somewhat awkward character, and more importantly why Padme liked him so much, aside from the fact that Hayden Christensen was just your typical handsome movie star. The reason being that Padme understood him better than anyone given the history, however brief, that they shared in The Phantom Menace. When in that movie, the characters were both children, but now both characters were simply old enough to kiss and get married. So the dynamic between them had drastically changed. I also understood that Padme wasn't quote-unquote turned on by Anakin slaughtering the Tusken Raiders because yes, some people genuinely believe that's what the scene was trying to convey.
You stupid!
Instead of what the scene was actually doing, which was showing Anakin having a mental breakdown and grieving over the tragic death of his mother. And Padme was simply trying to console him. Partially because she was a very kind person, but also because, aside from Jar Jar, R2-D2, and Qui-Gon Jinn, who is now dead, she was the only one who actually met Shmi Skywalker and saw what Anakin's life was like on Tatooine before going off to start his Jedi training. And when it came to the awkward first kiss, as George Lucas puts it...
But they've already decided in that very first awkward scene that they weren't going to go there with that first kiss.
And perhaps most shockingly to some, less than 10-year-old me understood that Anakin's now memed to death and infamous line wasn't arbitrarily bitching about sand.
I know, right?
And that what he was saying was set up by what Padme was saying.
I love the water. We used to lie out on the sand and let the sun dry us and try to guess the names of the birds singing.
And what Anakin was actually referencing was, again, his unpleasant upbringing on Tatooine, which again Padme was privy to, which is why she understood the subtext of what he was saying and why.
It ain't rocket science, for Christ's sake.
Like I said, I was extremely young and immature, as were my older brothers, who would watch and rewatch the films with me. And if there was one aspect of this scene that we would joke about, it wasn't the dialogue, it was the fact that Padme's dress was so revealing that she was practically daring Anakin to tear it off. To quote what my brother used to say, one rip and he's there. And this was a child of 10 at the time. But again, that's just a bunch of prepubescent humor between siblings, not an actual criticism of the movie by any stretch, although in the hands of YouTube content creators and or the media, it would probably be passed off as such. A funny story from more recently, however, I ended up rewatching the prequels with my girlfriend because, you know, I thought she should watch Star Wars in the correct chronological order that the creator intended.
You gotta remember, this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So, I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
And not in the order which the Generation X Empire Strikes Back is the greatest Star Wars movie because it had the least involvement from George Lucas, simps, insist the saga should be viewed in to preserve the oh so precious I am your father twist that they constantly deny doesn't carry the film for them. Not to throw stones at Empire Strikes Back, understand, but it seems to me that if these pricks weren't so insecure about how Empire would be ranked by newcomers to the franchise, it wouldn't bother them which order people choose to watch the saga in. And if they had any respect for Star Wars whatsoever, they would encourage that newcomers to the franchise watch the films in the order that Lucas intended. Of course, that's not to say that if you watch the saga out of order, that you can't fully grasp the nuances of George Lucas's story. After all, I myself was born long before the saga was finished, as were many of my friends and family which I shared my Star Wars experiences with, who also had no trouble understanding the overarching story of the saga. But the thing is, we didn't have a choice in the matter. Whereas now the saga is long finished, George Lucas has very publicly and clearly stated the order that he intended the movies to be watched in, and these clowns insisting that it be watched out of order to force their perspective onto other people is just incredibly disingenuous and spiteful, to say the least. And my sympathies go out to anyone who was suckered into that by their incredibly petulant and bitter uncle, father, or grandfather for that matter. Back to the story. Anyway, I sat her down, we watched the prequels in fairly quick succession, and I did my absolute best not to influence or gaslight her in any way to share my perspective on the matter, the same way that some tried to do to others when it came to their first watch through of the Star Wars prequels, particularly when it came to characters like Jar Jar Binks, as Jake Lloyd so gloriously calls this individual out for doing while he was on an interview panel some years ago, prior to the Disney sale.
The stories were meant for kids. I mean, have you met a kid who really hates Jar Jar Binks?
Actually, my little cousin hates him a lot.
How much of your influence did you give to him while the entire time you were watching the movie? Doesn't he suck? Doesn't he suck? And your little cousin was like,
yeah, no, I completely agree.
Now, just to put this in perspective here, my girlfriend is a fan of fantasy and is kind of a weeb when it comes to anime, so she was fairly open-minded when it came to Star Wars. The only thing I really did was fill in some of the blanks for some of the Star Wars terminologies used throughout the films, so she'd have a clearer grasp of the story for her first time watching it. Interestingly enough, when it came to Attack of the Clones, I didn't have to say a word in order for her to grasp the romantic aspect of the film and the character dynamic between Anakin and Padme. When it came to the scene of Anakin and Padme's first kiss, I asked her, why do you think Anakin is telling Padme why he doesn't like sand? And her response to me, to paraphrase, well, isn't it because she was talking about how nice it was growing up on her planet, and he was being reminded of bad memories growing up on that desert planet when he was a slave? In addition to that, once we finished watching the prequels, yes, including Revenge of the Sith, when I asked her which of the three was her favorite, again paraphrasing here, she told me it was Attack of the Clones precisely because she enjoyed the romance aspect of it, and also because she found the awkwardness between Anakin and Padme to be cute and endearing, which I'd imagine is for the most part the reaction Lucas was intending. Ergo, his intention was well executed, and granted, this is only one person's reaction to the films, but it was a good faith, honest watch through, and that was the result. And she sure as hell had a much greater understanding of these films than these self-appointed online experts and quote-unquote unsophisticated critics from the cesspool of online media outlets. Like I said, comprehending these films is not revolutionary by any stretch. They were primarily made to be understood by children. It's just that some of these incredibly obvious details seem to be massive revelations to certain individuals who have simply drunk the internet Kool-Aid and been influenced by this dumb fuck internet collective of so-called experts who couldn't be less qualified to assess these movies or anything of higher substance than a fucking Happy Meal. Because much like their videos and or articles on the matter, that's exactly what they are, Happy Meal content. It'll take a few minutes of your time, feed you the exact same crap over and over filled with empty calories that's designed to rot you from the inside out and leave you with absolutely nothing of value by the end. But because it's the recycled online popular status quo that makes them feel good in the moment for possessing the very misconceptions that are widely propagated and used to misinform and gaslight others into believing things about Star Wars and George Lucas that are simply not true. And hell, even I used to fall victim to it. Again, from my own personal experience, and I have told this story on my channel before, when I was first getting acquainted with the internet, I also felt for this internet gaslighting about the prequels, as well as the special editions and Star Wars creator George Lucas. In my late teens through to my early 20s, I hadn't rewatched the prequels in several years, and with nothing but my own vague memory of the movies to guide my judgment, and with the internet whispering, or rather constantly yelling in my ear, how supposedly terrible these films were, and how George Lucas, after the oh-so-cherished childhood original trilogy for some of these assholes, became a crazy person after that and ruined everything that apparently his wife saved in the edit for him, blah blah fucking blah. Despite that, I never grew to hate the prequels, but I was gaslit into thinking much less of them, and into believing much of the online misconceptions about them, and thinking back on the movies as if I was blinded by my childhood to recognize how supposedly awful they were, because that's how the internet wanted me to think. When I finally gave the prequels another watch through as an adult, what the internet was telling me and what I was actually watching did not seem to line up at all, but I still found the design choices for the story and the characters to be fascinating, and by the time I got to the now infamous sand line in Attack of the Clones, I then asked myself a very simple question that apparently none of these assholes seem to ask themselves, which is, why did billionaire, entrepreneur, filmmaking pioneer trained by Francis Ford Coppola and creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, why did he do this?
I got it!
And once I asked that very simple question, not only did the movies make way more sense than anything the internet and its cavalcade of online pseudo-intellectual film critics had to say on the matter, but it also opened my eyes to just how dumb and or deceptive some of these supposed experts and their verbal diarrhea actually were. And in addition to that, virtually every single source of information pertaining to George Lucas and Star Wars from reliable sources, such as audio commentaries, first-hand interviews with production crew members, the actors, and George Lucas himself, as well as books which have been published about the making of these films, and above all else, the films themselves, all supported the same incredibly easy and logical conclusion on the matter. That George Lucas, in fact, knew what the fuck he was doing. And he always knew what he was doing. Oh! Oftentimes, the simplest conclusion is also the correct one, though the internet and those who sought to propagate their childish, double-standard, nostalgia-driven agenda to discredit the man for wanting to relive their own childhood, while they wanted everyone to believe otherwise. However, with that being said, there is a flip side to this, and a portion of Star Wars fans that opt for a somewhat different approach that involves a lot of flip-flopping on why these films are quote-unquote actually bad, where they will concede that their previous notions and those of the internet were wrong, but then strangely they'll move the goalpost to an alternative, equally incorrect notion because they simply refuse to backpedal their general sentiment on George Lucas and the prequels. For whatever stubbornly petulant fucking reason, one of the ways they tend to do this is they'll acknowledge that George Lucas fulfilled his intentions perfectly, but this still, somehow, results in quote-unquote poor execution, or it's quote-unquote still bad and or doesn't make it good. And it's often not followed up with any kind of argument or logical rationale, because these individuals know they are beaten, they just can't admit it.
Man, give it up.
But there is one example that I did want to discuss in regards to this. See, up till now, I've done my very best to not pollute this video with constant cutaways to clips of really poor Star Wars takes by individual content creators and their moronic remarks regarding George Lucas and these films, because even though this video is responding to a lot of the quote-unquote criticisms and misconceptions surrounding George Lucas, as well as Star Wars as a whole, which is why I stated earlier that I would just reuse visuals from The People versus George Lucas to address most of the people I'm actually talking about, but I didn't want to turn this into a response video per se. There's a time and a place for that, which I reserve for another series of videos I do on this channel. However, regarding the quote-unquote awkwardness in Star Wars and Lucas's intentions being fulfilled, there is one video I wanted to cite, and it's actually one whose perspective I largely share on the matter of Attack of the Clones. It's a good video, definitely worth watching, but The other reason I wanted to do this is to show that I'm not exclusively biased to criticizing those who aren't fond of these movies. In fact, there are plenty of people that I tend to agree with on Star Wars that still manage to make me heavily disagree and or need to facepalm due to my frustrations.
Anakin and Padme on Naboo is pretty much a cursed sentence in the Star Wars fanbase, because it is guaranteed to bring up memories of one of these scenes.
I don't like sand.
Now that I'm with you again, I'm in agony. The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe.
And yes, I do have to admit, a lot of these scenes are kind of awkward, and perhaps not the most well-written, but there is a decent excuse, I guess, that could explain this, and that's simply that not only is Anakin awkward, but so is Padme, and therefore all the scenes are awkward. Which I guess makes sense. The only problem is, it doesn't make the scenes less awkward.
Okay, so we're agreed. The writing makes sense, and the execution of the scenes achieved the desired effect, so why the heck are we still docking points? Like, seriously, is awkwardness just not allowed in Star Wars?
But they've already decided in that very first awkward scene that they weren't going to go there with that first kiss.
Hell, is awkwardness just not allowed in movies in general, or television for that matter?
No!
Does the artist's intention become completely irrelevant and or flawed by default if it amounts to making the viewer uncomfortable? Because that's exactly what this individual's line of reasoning is saying. And this goes back to one of the earliest topics of this video, that what supposedly makes a well-executed scene and or well-executed dialogue is just what certain members of the audience deem as it sounds good to listen to, or it feels good to sit through. Meanwhile, intent, purpose, and consistency be damned. We've already run through why this logic is flawed, so I'll be brief, but again, the integrity of the art should never be sacrificed for the sake of a minority of bad faith, zero tolerance, tasteless dweebs for anything that doesn't immediately feed their dopamine receptors. Let's just, for argument's sake, test out this line of reasoning, and for this, I'm going to reference a very extreme example from one of the greatest television shows ever written, Breaking Bad. Now, there are plenty of uncomfortable and or awkward moments in this series that are, similarly to Star Wars, at least in principle, were completely intentional by the showrunner. But one scene in particular stands above the crop and is often cited by Breaking Bad fans as the quote-unquote worst moment in the entire show to sit through because of how uncomfortable and awkward it is. The scene in question is what I'll refer to as the happy birthday scene in Season 2. I'll admit, even I find it tough to sit through, but again, that doesn't mean I'm docking the show points because the sequence achieved its desired effect. It's very intentionally trying to be awkward and uncomfortable. And again, I'm not comparing this to Star Wars in terms of story and character, just in principle alone, in that Vince Gilligan, the creator and showrunner of Breaking Bad, achieved exactly what he wanted to with this scene, which in this particular instance was to make the audience disgusted with one of the main characters by creating a very awkward situation. For the sake of context, the wife of the show's protagonist is 8 months pregnant, and though from her perspective she and her husband don't have the smoothest marriage as of late, although it's important to note that she isn't yet aware of his illegal activities at this point in the show, but what she is aware of is the fact that he's battling terminal cancer. And she still goes out of her way to try and flirt with her boss, who apparently had sexually harassed her in the past, and she does so by singing a very breathy version of Happy Birthday to him in front of every single one of her work colleagues. Seriously, watch the scene and it will make your skin crawl. But because of that, people hate this scene so much, along with the characters involved, that they consider this the worst scene in the entire series. However, as I said, that was the desired effect the scene was meant to have. Does that mean it's poorly executed because of the fact that some viewers of the show hated it? To the point of it being so cringeworthy, borderlining unwatchable?
No!
On the contrary, the reaction the scene received is clearly evident that it was in fact well executed. In fact, it was so well executed, people often conflate their hatred towards the scene with how well the scene was actually written and directed. But again, those who find the scene unwatchable don't account for the majority of the Breaking Bad audience who know why it was written the way that it was. Hell, let's use a much simpler example. If a horror movie is trying to scare the audience and it becomes so frightening that certain audience members have to get up and leave the theater, is it poorly executed? No! Because the movie was designed to be scary. You can't compromise the intentions of the film because a small but vocal minority might find what you're doing to be too uncomfortable or awkward for their viewing tastes. It all comes down to what the art is intending to be on a case-by-case basis. And if it can justify itself by being consistent with the story and characters within it. And to bring this back to the topic at hand, which in the case of the awkward intentions behind the romance subplot of Attack of the Clones, is more than justified. And while we're on the subject of Attack of the Clones, I wanted to discuss how the casting was also not only appropriate for the art's intentions towards the characters, but also consistent with how George Lucas has always carefully selected his actors to be cast for Star Wars.
George likes to cast people that are so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to really get in there and give you a lot of direction.
Yeah.
In J.W. Rensler's Making of Empire Strikes Back, he quotes them saying, "Leia is not a real character. She is more of a caricature and is somewhat one-dimensional. It's not really possible to write out a list of Princess Leia's likes and dislikes. I do know her favorite color, though. It's white. She wears white all the time. I never knew that my character only had 2 dimensions until critics told me," Ford says. "I don't play the 3rd dimension because it wasn't the author's or the director's choice to do that, but it's there. It has to be there. I don't have to play it because it's me. It's part of me, so the simpler I keep myself, the more it shows. This is a simple kind of enterprise, and as such, the motives of the people involved are generally pretty straightforward." In both trilogies, the characters are intentionally written to be simple archetypes because this allows the story to move along quickly, and it facilitates easily recognizable relationships. The wide-eyed youth and his wise old master, the scoundrel and the princess, and the same is true for the characters in the prequels. Sam Jackson, when asked about his character, Mace Windu, says, "George never actually told me any of the qualities that Mace had. He never said, he's from here, he's from there, he's this, he's that. He's allowed me to totally create this character and fill him out in any way I've seen fit. I guess he trusts what I bring to this character. If I'm doing something wrong, I'm sure he would tell me, but generally he has allowed me to totally create this guy." That Sam Jackson is actually a bad motherfucker like Windu, or that Carrie Fisher is a witty spitfire like Leia, are fun observations in isolation, of course, but they're also emblematic of a pattern George has in his casting. He casts actors who are already similar in personality and aura to the characters he writes, and then steps back and gives them the freedom to act how they feel is right for the part.
I was looking for somebody who was very boyish and young, but had sort of a James Dean sullen edge to him.
Now, I've heard plenty of online praise for Hayden Christensen's acting in recent years, and rightfully so, and I'm certainly glad that Hayden is getting the respect he damn well deserves, because he did a bloody good job fulfilling the role of his character, which many of the old guard of internet dumbshits seem to be under the confusion that Hayden Christensen's performance was some sort of mistake that completely missed the mark for Anakin Skywalker.
But if there's just one thing that Lucas should have gotten right with this movie, it's the deep, dark unrest that's boiling inside of the character of Anakin. But he seems to confuse that with being a whiny brat.
But there was no mistake. None whatsoever. Christensen did exactly what George Lucas wanted for how he envisioned the character. However, once again, some of these complete and utter morons are still trying to flip-flop and move the goalpost in order to find new ways to support their pitiful anti-Lucas narrative that's been built on quicksand and is rapidly approaching its expiration date. And they do this by praising Hayden as an actor, but once again turning the blame on George, saying that Christensen was given crappy material to work with, or that George Lucas didn't allow him to shine as an actor. Same with some of the other actors in the prequels, which is just completely nonsensical. And to give you a perfect groan-inducing example of what I'm talking about, I refer to this recent interview that Hayden Christensen did with Wired. Not the interview itself, but again, the brain rot that festers in the comment section that's largely made up of a bunch of gullible, empty-headed dumb fucks who have no idea what the fuck they're talking about and just come to the dumbest possible fucking conclusions. And you'll see that one of the top comments that clearly doesn't have a fucking clue reads, quote, Hayden Christensen played the part of a whiny, arrogant, impulsive, morally tormented young Jedi extremely well, but at the same time it says the clunky dialogue and other failings of the prequels were on George. The fans got it wrong for a long time, and I'm glad so many people have come around.
Okay, what the fuck?
No, dipshits, unfortunately, you're still getting it wrong.
Unfortunately, the debate is not over.
Now, while the director and writer is certainly responsible for any of the shortcomings that may arise in their productions, certainly not exclusive to Star Wars, but in this particular instance, this absolute knobstick is once again falling into the widely propagated internet narrative of George not knowing how to direct or write dialogue. We've already gone through and demonstrated why that isn't the case, and discussed ad nauseum how George Lucas was writing and directing for Star Wars, not your by-the-numbers action flick, and he's always done so in a style that is fully catered and consistent to these films. Once again, returning to that comment from that recent interview that Hayden Christensen did with Wired, and it should honestly come as no surprise that this comment came from the Wired audience, which is basically just a petri dish of know-nothing morons that encompasses most of that fan base, who will just gullibly believe whatever the most popular guy in the box tells them to. But again, going back to George Lucas's directing and acting style for Star Wars.
George likes to cast people that are so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to really get in there and give you a lot of direction.
Yeah. It's completely moronic to selectively praise Hayden for perfectly fulfilling his role and being perfectly cast, but simultaneously blaming George for the quote-unquote clunky dialogue and failings of the prequels pertaining to Anakin's character, because George Lucas was the one who fucking cast him as Anakin Skywalker in the first place, and he did so for the same reasons he always cast his actors. Because he not only wants good actors, but individuals who are so much like what he has envisioned the character to be, both in their physical and personality traits.
Whenever you're casting, first of all, you're always looking for a really good actor, somebody that really has a lot of craft and is really very talented. Action! Who fits the part that you've created. And in this particular case, I was looking for somebody who was very boyish and young, but had sort of a James Dean sullen edge to him.
Hayden had all the elements of the character.
Don't try to grow up too fast.
I am grown up.
She's beginning to see him as an attractive young man, but they've already decided in that very first awkward scene that they weren't going to go there with that first kiss. He lets himself go here. It's intended to be overly dramatic, sort of almost even overly operatic in its emotional intensity on his part. He's young, and he's kind of spilling his guts out to her. She doesn't quite know how to deal with this, and it's putting her kind of on the spot, but she ultimately will refuse here to go along with him. In relation to their emotional maturity, he is much more impetuous and much more immature. She is obviously older and you know, in a professional thing, but a queen and a senator and a leader, so that she's much more reality based on all of this. Even he realizes that if they did have a relationship, it would lead to doom. There's no way it could work. When she reminds him of where this would lead and what the consequences would be, he does accept it.
Not to mention, despite somehow managing to describe Anakin's character almost perfectly, this empty-headed idiot,
an empty-headed fucking dumb fuck,
still misses the fact that Anakin's quote-unquote clunky dialogue was specifically tailored to the awkwardness of his character for the sake of consistency. Ergo, it was not a quote-unquote failing of the prequels on behalf of George Lucas. Again, unless we're saying we can't have awkwardness in Star Wars, or that awkwardness and or cringy and uncomfortable moments in Star Wars equals bad and unacceptable, completely disregarding the meaning and or context behind it that there may be, which, as we've already discussed, is a very moronic rationale to have. Now, months after recording this, when I went back to search for that same comment, it was mysteriously nowhere to be found. And in that amount of time, I had misplaced the JPEGs, so I'm unable to provide the visuals, but I was sure to make note of them in this video's script. And you'll know I'm being honest here because chances are you've likely heard or seen 1,000 of these dumb remarks from both Star Wars illiterates, as well as this same collective of Star Wars degenerates. In the replies to this comment, I found these absolute side splitters of dumb fuckery. We only have time for 3, so I'll quickly run through them. This reply, again, repeats the popular quote-unquote yes man misconception surrounding George's collaboration for the prequels. This reply actually thinks the quote-unquote clunky dialogue for Anakin was tailored to his character by accident. And then you have this reply that possesses weapons-grade projection of an even higher caliber than the fucking Death Star, saying the prequels were convoluted, and it's the movie's job to capture the viewer, not for the viewer to be astute. Cough. Despite the fact that you can find dozens upon dozens of out-of-the-theater reactions to these films that proves the films weren't convoluted to the point of being incomprehensible, as well as the fact that these films were mainly targeted at children, and children for the most part, aside from a handful of obscure details and terminologies, were able to understand them. And this comment is also just a perfect example of something to keep in mind. And that is, if any internet twat out there claims that the prequels were convoluted, I guarantee you, convoluted is just code they used.
And it's code.
Code?
Yeah, code.
To mask their own stupidity and or bad faith interpretations because they either lacked the intelligence to comprehend them or simply didn't care to. And what they're actually asking for isn't a better written movie, but rather one that's simply dumbed down for their own taste. In which case, if you fall into that demographic, fuck you. That's not a Star Wars problem, it's a you problem. And what's even more alarming is that these individuals spout this word diarrhea with such conviction as if they have absolutely no idea how dumb it makes them sound. Alright then, I guess it's time we actually misused Harrison Ford's quote for the powers of good for a change.
You can type this stuff, but you can't say it. Move your mouth while you're talking, while you're typing it.
Anyway, back to the acting. Just like with Hayden Christensen, the same rationale was used for why George Lucas cast Jake Lloyd as child Anakin Skywalker in The Phantom Menace, which detractors of the prequels also criticize as some sort of mistake. Spoiler, it wasn't.
I know, right?
And their rationale for why Jake Lloyd's casting was supposedly a mistake may sound ridiculous, because it is, but I promise you I'm not making any of this up. But a large portion of the older Star Wars fans who criticized Jake Lloyd for his performance are also those who were extremely pissed off with having their headcanon about their precious Darth Vader squashed by having him portrayed as an innocent, kind-hearted child to begin with. And they seem to try and pass that off as it's just Jake Lloyd being a quote-unquote bad actor or a quote-unquote horrible casting choice. And the ones who aren't that shallow, though certainly not by much, will often cite the original audition test screening as George Lucas having a blind eye for acting chops for not casting this child actor instead to play the role of Anakin. And from what I've seen, this rationale is mainly on the basis of him making less mistakes while delivering the lines in the audition, and also the fact that he comes across as a kid who is clearly damaged and has a brewing dark side in his performance.
You missed the point. What point?
The reason why this child actor was passed over was no mistake, and that's not what Lucas was looking for. As we've discussed, in addition to the acting, he's looking for the physical and personality qualities of the actor and how much they resemble the character he's written and what he's envisioned that character to be. This alternative child actor might have done well enough in the audition, but doing well in the audition and being right for the character are two very different things.
You can see the difference between the two kids. Yeah. One is going to move the production along a lot faster. Right. And the other one, I have to just do a zillion takes and cut the performance. But the performance sort of rises way above what the other one does. Because it's so unpredictable and it's kind of unstudied.
Will I ever see you again?
Thanks for bringing that up.
I hope so.
Who'd you choose?
I like Jake. Because he seems more natural. I mean, I like his body language.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not trained. And this one just hits the beats.
Yeah, I was going to say some people audition real well.
And contrary to the rationale people like to use for why this actor was the better choice, 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker isn't a dark and disturbed kid who possesses a brewing darkness within his personality. 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker is meant to start out as a seemingly ordinary, kind-hearted young boy who has some very subtle predispositions imprinted in his personality that won't have fully materialized until he's much older. I mean, hell, do you really think it's a coincidence that in Revenge of the Sith, when Anakin returns to the very same council chamber where he undergoes his Jedi test in the Phantom Menace, that he comes across a Jedi youngling that bears a crazy resemblance to Jake Lloyd's appearance and demeanor when Anakin was a child? No, that was a carefully planned moment to show the audience how far Anakin had fallen over the course of 3 movies, and that he was essentially selling his soul and killing himself when he betrayed the Jedi. As discussed, George Lucas has always been meticulous when it comes to casting his actors. Such has been the case for every single Star Wars film because it's all a part of his filmmaking style, and Jake Lloyd was no exception at all. And I mean, hell, there's even an entire webisode called 3000 Anakins, meaning George Lucas and his casting director had sifted through 3,000 audition tapes and potential candidates for casting the role, so the fact that these know-nothing dipshits insist that Jake Lloyd was a mistake is nothing short of amusing. When Jake starts delivering his lines, you can see Lucas's face light up because Jake's delivery and his personality for the character of Anakin hits the mark for exactly what he's looking for.
Scene 1, take 2.
Are you an angel? What? An angel.
He had every imaginable element built into this kid, from mechanical ability to earnestness. His look was important, his intelligence. And usually children's roles aren't that complex. And in Anakin, you had to have it all. We had Leia and Luke, and then from that we had to draw who their parents could or would be. And so we're kind of going backwards. Natalie had to look like Carrie Fisher, and Anakin had to look like Mark Hamill. I was matching parents to children, and I was matching an ensemble cast.
One of the most important things in this particular character is that he is a wonderfully nice boy. And then there's this very intuitive kind of gut feel you get about that's the one. With Jake, I just got that feeling.
But that's not what certain older fans had envisioned for the character of young Darth Vader. And so they got pissy and instead decided to take their frustrations out on the actor and breathe life into this ridiculous horseshit narrative that George Lucas didn't know how to direct and cast actors. And that it was other people who saved Star Wars from him, which is all just a means to justify their double standards for why they can still enjoy and hold his earlier movies in such high esteem. Because supposedly and exclusively in those movies, he had collaborators that would question his ideas. And in the newer films, he was only surrounded by quote-unquote yes men who couldn't stop him from making all these mistakes, when these were never mistakes to begin with. And George simply knew what he wanted with the acting and directing, and it didn't line up with what the self-appointed online empty-headed Star Wars critics wanted. But Star Wars was never about what the critics wanted.
Do you think this is going to be as big as Star Wars?
Bigger! Yeah. Bigger!
And yet a lot of the critics are panning it.
Well, what do they know?
I've discovered that most critics themselves are cinematically illiterate. They don't really know much about movies. They don't know the history. They don't know the technology. They don't know anything. So for them to try to analyze it, they're lost.
How worried are you that the critics are not going to like this new movie?
Oh, I'm not worried at all. They haven't liked any of them, really. And they especially haven't liked the last two. So,
well, exactly.
Hey, I mean, it can't get any worse.
Storytelling as a whole should never be about what the critics wanted. Storytelling and filmmaking as a whole is about what the artist wants. And Star Wars, first and foremost, is and always should be about the story that George wants to tell and knows what Star Wars is. It was his story, his characters, his universe, And again, according to Paul Duncan, as well as what we've discussed from Rinsler's books, going back as far as the first Star Wars film in 1977, Lucas has always had the same methodology and style for making these movies. And while the majority of the vitriol against Jake Lloyd's performance, much like the vitriol against the prequels, was for the most part only ever propagated in the online pseudo-critical circle jerk of social rejects, which later became far more vocal when the popularity of YouTube reviews became a thing.
I think that little Anakin Skywalker, and everyone's going to say it, stole that movie.
It was never a general sentiment shared by the majority of Star Wars fans, and if the Phantom Menace's record-breaking re-release is proof of anything, it never was. These movies were beloved, and always have been, because the majority of George Lucas's Star Wars fans weren't shifting through shit to try and discredit the man, nor did they ever buy into the ridiculous notion that he didn't know what he was doing. Even if they weren't privy to all of the information that I've provided for you in this video, it was just common sense that George Lucas, creator of Star Wars, knew what he wanted for his own space fantasy saga. He had a style and a voice for these movies that made them thoroughly unique in all its aspects, which is why they're so memorable and endlessly rewatchable. And in the years since walking away from the franchise, that has never been more evident than it is today.
Victory!
Look, the bottom line is this. The creative and collaborative process in the making of the Star Wars original trilogy was exactly the same as that of the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Yes, there were different collaborators involved, but they were all given the opportunity to provide input, whether it came to improvising dialogue,
Aggressive negotiations, what's that?
Negotiations with a lightsaber.
or art design.
It's hard to get one person to do two different planets because it all comes out looking the same. That's always been a problem we've had of trying to get the variety of design that we need.
You have disappointments when your thing doesn't get picked or whatever, but there's always a really good reason for your image not being picked. And it could be something as basic as, this is great, George says this all the time, this is great, not for my movie, but this is great, it just doesn't fit into the story that we're telling.
And we would go through various designs. I mean, this would go over a period of months while I was writing the script. So I would rewrite the script as I was beginning to see the environment and what I had to work with to design the sequence.
Or visual effects.
Very rarely do I not get what I want. There are a few times when we all sit down and give up and say, this is too far, too fast. But they know that eventually I'll come back to it on the next film.
There was a number of us who had been wanting to do a computer-generated Yoda. And after Phantom Menace finished, we started talking about it again. And coming up with the idea of, well, maybe we should do it between the shows. Building the new computer-generated Yoda as a proof of concept for George.
I'll get the animators to do those 4 shots we were talking about, and take them up to George in a week or so.
Okay.
And hopefully he goes for it, and we can convince him that we can do it all CG.
Rob has a test to show you. Yoda.
It's energy. Surrounds us. Environment us. Luminous seems to be, not just through magic.
Very good. Fantastic. Thanks.
Or even the musical score.
There's no question in my mind, for George, the single biggest collaborator that he has is John.
He probably rang me a year ago to tell me that the time was coming, that his script was going to be ready, and that he was about ready to shoot the film, and that the music would be needed by such and such a time in the calendar. And then I would get another phone call 2 or 3 months later, and he would fix a spotting date where we go in a dark room and talk about where the music is going to go and what it should do, etc.
Then it goes from that into religioso force. Yeah. It just has to be something that kind of says, we're fighting back now. But I think we need to keep that kind of fighting back theme going to keep the energy up.
The only concern that one might have is that you may want a version without the chorus, but I don't know if you even want to contemplate that.
I love the chorus.
It gives it that churchy.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's going to work. I mean, you didn't realize this, but it really goes into the third film very well, and I think it'll be an important thing to reprise. I mean, that definitely has the quality of the inevitable fate of doom.
with larger hands at work.
And the most important thing to remember is the collaborators from the original trilogy that were no longer there weren't there for a number of different reasons, be it personal or professional. But the biggest reason of all is that despite their talents, they, with the exception of the actors and John Williams, these collaborators that were no longer present for the prequel trilogy were, at the end of the day, completely interchangeable. They were simply hired hands, no more and no less, that made valuable contributions to Star Wars, but were still hired hands nonetheless, all of which were replaceable. However, the personality, style, and quality of Star Wars resides within the creator and author of Star Wars, and always has, that being none other than Mr. George Lucas. And it shows, because none of those collaborators knew what was best for the overall story the way that George Lucas did. That's why George Lucas, despite his willingness to collaborate with them, and would occasionally take their ideas on board, also rejected so many of their ideas for his films that this same collective of douchebags who love to lump all of their praise on The Help would be sounding off about how those changes would have ruined Star Wars for them. And just to name but a few, those ideas being Marshall Lucas wanting to add scenes back into the films that George Lucas made sure remained cut because he didn't want to tank the pacing, lines or story ideas in the script conferences with Kirshner and Kasdan that would have made no sense for the overall story, and that Lucas put his foot down and made sure never had a presence in the script, Mark Hamill suggesting dialogue additions where no dialogue was needed, Lucas knowing when to kill off characters like Ben Kenobi and when not to kill off characters like Han Solo, as Harrison Ford and Lawrence Kasdan suggested, never forget. And above all else, George Lucas knew how to select and utilize the talent when it came to making his films. And it shows, since many of the collaborators who did not return for the Star Wars prequels only ever won Oscars, and just for the record, I'm only borrowing the same shallow metric that these douchebags like to use, these individuals only won Oscars and are really only known by most people for the work they did under George Lucas, and almost nothing else, the exception of course being the actors, and George Lucas was wisely insistent on many of those same brilliant hired hands returning to Star Wars for the Star Wars prequels as well, including but not limited to guys like Dennis Muren, Ben Burt, and of course the legendary John Williams, all of which were experienced on Star Wars and knew how to work with George, and in turn he knew how to work with them, and that's why he wanted them back. The same can be said for many of the newcomers who collaborated on the prequels, who George Lucas had handpicked because they had already worked with him on the Young Indiana Jones television series. And well, same principle applied. They had already proven to be great collaborators on that series. Those individuals including but not limited to Jonathan Hales and especially Rick McCallum for that matter. But in addition to that, and most importantly, George Lucas has always had an incredible eye for talent, which for any good director or producer for that matter is just one of his many talents. And thus for the prequels, Lucas brought on even more exceptional collaborators such as Nick Gillard, John Knoll, and Rob Coleman, to name but a few. And of course, just like the original trilogy, George Lucas went through the same exact casting process, with the exceptions of knowing to cast already established and well-respected actors for certain key roles, literally thousands of auditions for many of the main characters that he was looking for that same magic which he found on the original trilogy. Actors who, through their own natural demeanor, that would perfectly suit and embody the character that he envisioned, which he then directed in that same improvisational documentary style, same with the acting and camera work as well as the dialogue, albeit this time with a different story and with different characters. It's just the detractors of George Lucas liked pedantically and dishonestly pretend otherwise because they didn't get the shallow, pathetic, vacuous childhood rerun that they'd always craved. There are some out there who attribute the magic of Star Wars entirely to nostalgia, which would be disingenuous because nostalgia can be applied to anything, although these same clowns like to pretend that's only the case, and the sole reason for the increase in love and praise directed at the prequel trilogy over the years, which is nothing short of amusing, considering these were the same man-children that kept Star Wars on life support for 16 whole years after Return of the Jedi. And over such trivial and shallow aspects, mind you, as a relatively nothing character in a bucket head that did practically nothing meaningful for the entire story. Many of these same people also pretend the magic of Star Wars was due solely to the collaborators that exclusively worked on their precious childhood trilogy, which is their own pathetic rationale for why they're still allowed to enjoy it, despite the childhood silliness, flaws and all, whilst condemning everything in Star Wars that came after. Unless, of course, it's an overblown, mediocre fanfiction from the mouse that allows them to remain in denial about their own buyer's remorse for trading down on Star Wars to lesser creators. But the magic of Star Wars has and has always only had one common denominator. And it's no secret what, or in this case who, that common denominator was. And there's no possible debate left on the matter, nor should there have ever been. The magic of Star Wars lies with the creator, the maker, the master storyteller, George Lucas. His philosophy, his skill, his hard work, his talent, and his style and personality for filmmaking that carried across the entire franchise and maximized the potential and then some of everyone selected to work with him on bringing his vision to life. The magic of Star Wars never left until George Lucas did. It's as simple as that. And this is why every fan fiction that has come out under the Mickey Mouse brand for the IP, barring a few exceptions, has been empty, vacuous, soulless, derivative, nonsensical, shallow garbage, and even the scarce few instances of competence that has been churned out of that creative vacuum of a company have only been pale imitations at best of what came before, to the same creative prowess that Star Wars possessed under the magical touch of George Lucas. And that's not even an insult, that's just a straight up fact. You can't replicate creativity, you can't replicate a work of art, or the voice and intellect of the creator. You can only imitate it at best. And if you have any respect for Star Wars whatsoever, and not for what you pretend or would like Star Wars to be, then you need to accept that and stop bargaining with yourself. Preference is fine, enjoy whatever you will, be it Star Wars or Star Wars fan fiction, but recognize what is. And speaking of what is, does that mean we've reached the end of this story?
Not quite. There's room for a little more.
Much like the original trilogy, both the media and certain fans have also spread their fair share of lies and misinformation about the prequel trilogy, but more specifically, certain actors who apparently had their lives quote-unquote ruined by having the misfortune of starring in those films under George Lucas's direction. And I briefly touched on this earlier, but as it turns out, there's a lot more to the story that needs to be brought to light. And it's honestly sickening. Not just the long-standing lies that both the media and this degenerate collective of fans chose to propagate and reinforce at every turn, but also the level of hypocrisy involved when you compare the climate surrounding the prequels in the years since their release compared to that of the Disney fanfiction era, as you'll soon see. However, that will be saved for the final part of this video series that aims to address all of that, as well as tie everything else up in a neat little bow. If you've made it to the end of part 3 and have been keeping up with this series, thank you so much. And if you've started this series on part 3, again, I highly suggest you go back and start from part 1 and 2, or elaborating on in this video. But on the off chance that you started with part 3, I didn't want you to come in completely blind either. Anyway, I hope you managed to learn a lot in this video, or at the very least, managed to enjoy yourself. And I'd also recommend checking out some of the creators that I've referenced so far in my series to support or provide further nuance to the points I've put forward in my own videos. If you like this video series, then they're definitely worth your time. I'll see you all in the Legacy of George Lucas Part 4, the final part of this series. Until then, take care and bye for now.